Hey guys, in today's video I'd love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. They call me Alex now, though that's not the name on my birth certificate. Doesn't matter anymore. Names feel flimsy after what happened. It was late October of last year, 2023. Joshua Tree. Yeah, that Joshua Tree. People go there for peace, for the desert vibes, for Instagram pics. I went to escape. City static had become a living thing, a constant hum of obligations and disappointments. I was chasing silence, the kind you could hear in your bones. My plan was simple: to carve out a life, off-grid, deep in the Mojave. Wind and sun, that was the soundtrack. Scorching days. Freezing nights, I was ready. I'd saved, planned, prepped. Solar, rainwater, survival skills honed from years of let's just say I knew how to handle myself. Physical labor. Redemption and sweat, right? Tried to outrun the ghosts, the what is that clawed in my gut. Mistake number one in opening my mouth. Told a couple of old faces about my grand desert escape. One of them was this guy, Cade. Cade Briggs, we called him. Smooth talker, that kind of charm that felt like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap into menace. Friend, maybe. But there was this itch under his skin, a restlessness that made you uneasy. Cade volunteered to help me settle in. Expertise in tough environments, he claimed. I hesitated. Building a homestead solo is brutal, even for a stubborn mule like me. But help sounded good. Days later, after I'd marked out my patch of desert dust, Cade rumbled up in a beat-up truck, overflowing with gear. Impressive gear. For a heartbeat, it felt good. Friendly face in the middle of nowhere. He flashed that tight grin. Looked like you could use a hand, Alex. I nodded. Didn't realize how hollow I was until he showed up, offering something that felt like human connection. For a week, we sweated, wrestled with foundations for a small cabin. Sun beat down like a hammer, relentless. But the work, it was a bomb. Cade, though, he was different. Desert wanderlust, he called it. Vanished after lunch, truck kicking up dust devils, or just walked off in the dunes, camera GPS thingy in hand. He exploring, he'd shrug when I asked. Place is empty. Fascinating. Then, late one afternoon, packing up tools, she appeared, woman. Tall, lean, long, dark, brain, a Yazzie. Local guide, she said. Took folks out, showed them the land, spun stories of its past, her family's myths. Friendly enough, maybe a little guarded. But there was this urgency in her voice when she warned us about night wanderings. Thank you, I told her. Cade just scoffed. Afraid of what, exactly? Dismissive tone, but Lena held his gaze. Desert has guardians, she said, voice low. Some welcome, some don't. Small nod, and she walked off towards this dusty SUV parkway off. After that, days blurred into a kind of strained calm. Then the weirdness started. Tools. Namers. Small stuff. Vanishing. Reappearing in odd spots. First, I wrote it off to desert fatigue, the wind. But it got deliberate. Set a wrench down by the foundation, come back, hour later, it's standing upright in the sand. Like someone displayed it. One night, woke to a sound. Faint, carried on the wind. Coyote yelp, maybe. But human edge to it. Scream. Goosebumps crawled up my skin. Peered out of my tent. Nothing. Moonlit sand endless. Cade was up to, crouched at his tent flap. Questioning look, shrugged. Both went back down. Sleep came in jagged pieces. Next morning, Lena again. Face tighter now. Alex, she said, voice careful. Things disturbed, desert's restless. Cade suddenly there, lurking behind me. Disturbed how? I asked. Lena hesitated. Mile east, land dipped into a shallow gully. Morning sun sharp, highlighting tracks in the sand. Grotesque, deep elongated. Neither human nor animal. Jagged claw marks at the ends. Overlapping prints, like something paced, arms prickled. Even Cade, usually so smug, frowned. No way, that's coyote. Lena knelt, finger tracing a print. Voice barely a breath. Red claw, she whispered. Storyson, once, shapeshifter, evil. Wanders night looking for souls. Cade snorted derisive, but his eyes stayed glued to the prints. Local legends, he said, like that explained everything. Lena's gaze snapped to him, flicker of anger, but she said nothing more. Silent walk back, an easy air thick between us. Days after, more anomalies. Clumps of matted fur, half buried. Jackrabbit remains arranged strangely. Desert itself felt resentful. Each find a cold shiver. Nights howls got closer, more frequent. Gut, deep croak sometimes, nothing I'd ever heard. Work went on strained. Cade's disappearances stretched longer, pressed him. He dodged. Geological samples, building site scouting. Asked to tag along, grin, brush off, didn't like it. Survival focus, cabin against desert storm sun. 2 pairs of hands wasn't much. Then the outpost. Cade led me there. Before dawn, practically vibrating with excitement. LX, gotta see this. Gutted me far from camp. How our trudging dunes. Derelict building, half swallowed by sand. Graffiti-smeared crumbling walls. Rusted wire fence, maybe a courtyard once. Inside, stale air, rot. Broken glass, scattered junk underfoot. Dark stains on the floor. Oh, something worse. Cornered tattered backpack, single hiking boot. Unsettling. Bones, some half collapsed, heart slammed, human femurs, picked clean. Small pile. Nearly pooped. Stumbled back to courtyard, tried to breathe. Cade watched. Expression unreadable. Horrified. Curious. Demanded we call someone. He lowered his Volix. Smart about this. Cops. Suspects. Heads down for now. Chilling logic. Fear clouded my head. Let him talk me down. Leave it. Undisturbed. His hand trembled, though. Not as calm as he played. Hurried out. Damage done. Bone images burned in my mind. Wouldn't let go. That evening, maybe. Lena again. Breathless. Eyes wide. Friend missing. Guide. Last seen near abandoned outpost. Same place. Told her. Lena's hand flew to her mouth. Tears fighting to break. Hate to go back. CF at anything of his. Cade from the shadows shook his head. Not safe. Tried to talk her out of it. But her face a raw grief, mirroring my own unease. Agreed. First morning. Next woke up. Lena gone. Truck's footprints leading into dunes. Struggle in the sand, drag marks. Scuffed prints, brief, violent. Mine went blank, yelled for Cade. Frantic. Nowhere. Grabbed flashlight, water hunting knife. Started searching. Clue. Then Cade reappeared, panting. Eyes wild. Spotted someone dragging Lena. Couldn't catch up. Lear. Furious, no time for blame. Followed tracks. Deeper desert, hours. Wind whipped up, dust devils danced, visibility gone. Panic clored. How far? Evening fell. Rocky ravine. Tucked in its depths. Makeshift camp. Tattered tent. Scattered supplies. A bizarre symbol scrawled on rock. Dried blood. Heart hammered. Lena's watch on the ground. Torn strap. Spun around desperate. Then Cade's face. Expression triumphant. Before I could ask, he lunged. Slammed me against a boulder. Head cracked against stone. Barely kept it from splitting. Rage twisted his features. Words spilled out. Awakening old ways, harnessing Red Claw's power. Sickening rush. Cade's desert obsession wasn't about helping me. Cult. Something ancient dark. Skinwalker worship. Lenning standing in the way. Alex. Cade snarled. Needed Lena alive. Knowledge her people. You. Witness. Tried to fight free. Pistol. Small black. Waistband. Pointed at my face. Froze, movement in the tent, stomach twisted. Lena, unconscious ground, bruised face, arms tied behind her. Fury terror surged, lunged at Cade. Pistol whip. Darkness rushed in, blacked out, briefly. Next thing, Cade dragging Lena. Crude altar, flat rock Reverend Center. Tall candles, sickly yellow glow. Chanting. Words not human. Calling out to Red Claw. Mind reeling, not superstition. Cade or thing in him believed. Unnatural croaker code. Ravine, blood ran cold. Figure stepped from behind boulder. Tall, jangly. Limbs bent wrong. Human-ish shape, face distorted. Protruding jaws, sunken gleaming eyes. Hands claws curved firm length. Stench rolled off it. Gag! Red Claw. Cade turned reverent smile, incantation. Welcoming idol. Red Claw hissed. Low guttural. Then Cade's eyes rolled back. Body stiffened. Horrible voice ripped from his throat, raspy, layered. Multiple voices. Inhuman. Creature moved on Lena. Consciousness flickering back. Breathing terror, summoned every scrap of courage. Staggered up, hip pounding. Tuck at Cade. Both hit ground. Gun skittered away. Overhead, Red Claws shrieked grotesque, reverberated canyon walls. Cade's strength unreal. Fueled by that presence. Tossed me off. Landed hard shoulder. Distraction. Lena rolled away from altar. Red Claw lunged. Scramble for gun. Fingers closed around grip. Blur. Fired. Twice. Figure. Monstrous with jerk back. Deafening screech. Vision swam. Beast recoiled. Cade roared. Fury. Possession. Rushed me again. Fired shot. Warned him off. Didn't flinch. Bullet grazed his side. Still coming. Snarl twisted his face. Lena behind him. Rock. Heavy. Sickening thud. Slam back of his head. Kick. Red Claw. Wounded. Stunned. Honeywell. Slilenos. Cut her arm dodged. Last bullet. Praying shot route. Echo rang ravine. Creature staggered. Collapsed. One. Knee form shimmered, nauseatingly, shift, final snarl. Sank to ground, limbs twitching, dark fluid seeped from wounds. Couldn't breathe, dying. Watched. Kaladi shriveward. Nothing left but tatters of skin identifiable. Lena's eyes filled tears, hurried to my side. Clutching bleeding arm. Cade lay still. Blood pooling skull. Didn't matter. Bond with Red Claw monster. Willing, stumbled out of ravine. Half-mad shock. Civilization. Help. Campsite first. Hours wandering darkness. Faint moon glow. Familiar landmarks dawn. Half-finished cabin. Phone. No signal. Lena. Satellite phone. Local police. Hours later, upload FBI badges. Statements jiggly around site. Photos. Lena's bruises. My cuts. Scrapes. Stiff expressions. Preconceived notions. Revine return. No creature trace. No Cade's body. Bizarre campsite dismantled. Hastily. Someone after us. Official line dangerous drifter. Wild animal. Stress Lena me seeing things. Police questions. Pointed. Discredit us. Cover Red Claw. Ghost story. Desert full of them days. Lena vanished. Hurry gone. Didn't say where. Family fled. Ancestral secret safe. Nightmares. Taken again. Red Claw. Not dead. Husk too convenient. Disappearance. Me. Tried to stay. Cabin finish. Peace. Every night new horrors. Dreams. Inhuman howl echo. Fleeting shadows. Vision's edge. Mind tricks. Desert mocking. Never know. Stayed long enough. No one believed. Whispered rumors locals. Ravine bodies. Vanished men. Finally left. Pack savage. Drove from Joshua Triway hit. Pulled over. Sobbed. Nobody believed. Nobody wanted to. Authorities erased it. Evil unfathomable. Writing this now. Why proof? Not insane. Scars on arms. Healed gash on head. Cade strike. Lena's tear. Streaked face. Ravine. Crawford. Desert. Remote. New Mexico. Joshua Tree. Wastland. Warnings. Land cruel. Legends real. Name whispered wind. Footprints shouldn't be. Don't linger. Things in that desert. Don't forgive trespassers. Red Claw wears skin of nightmares. My name is Alex Riley, and I'm 32 years old. October 2023, that's when it all went sideways. I landed in the heart of the Australian outback, fueled by a desperate kind of hope and a notebook crammed with ideas. I'd picked this isolated stretch of red dirt, miles from Alice Springs and its low hum of civilization, searching for peace and inspiration. My new book was about outback legends and the endless. Some baked plains promised silence, isolation, a perfect escape from the tangled mess of my past. But the outback I was about to learn had secrets buried deeper than just sand and rock. I'd rented a dinky little cabin, a shack really, clinging to the edge of a forgotten track. The wood was bleached gray, the floors groaned underfoot, like the desert itself was whispering stories through the timbers. My first day was the usual drill: unpacking, getting settled, a slow, cautious walk around the property. Red earth distant, hazy mountains, weirdly shaped cacti. I scribbled it all down in my journal. On the surface, it was the peaceful retreat I craved. That evening, perched on the sagging porch, watching the sun bleed behind jagged rock formations, a sudden chill knifed through me, despite the day's lingering heat. Temperature drop, desert thing, I told myself, but then I saw it. A shadow moving wrong. Not like an animal, not natural. A silhouette mirroring me. Heart hammering, I froze, convinced I'd imagined it. Just the isolation playing tricks. Next morning, I headed out with Kalen. Met him at a dusty gas station in the nearest blink. And you'll miss a town. Local guide, he said. Kalen was a man of few words, face leathered by the relentless sun. Offered to show me the outback's hidden spots, places even locals steered clear of, he claimed. He was calm, steady, but there was something underneath, a current I couldn't place. Secrets he wasn't letting on. We bumped along narrow dirt tracks, past vast, empty scrubland and lonely rock outcrops. Keelan pointed out ancient Aboriginal rock art etched into canyon walls, whispering stories of the dreamtime, of spirits that walked this land long before us. I scribbled furiously, curiosity battling a growing unease that seemed to rise from the very ground. Hiking along an old trail, I noticed them. Footprints, oddly repetitive. Mine, or so I thought, but they veered off in directions that made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Kalen just chuckled, quiet and low, said it was the desert, playing tricks, mirroring your steps in the shifting sands. But his eyes didn't match his words. Dread prickled under my skin, growing with every step. Later that afternoon, we stumbled onto a narrow path, flanked by rocks carved with strange symbols. Spirals, claw-like marks unsettling, like they pulsed with something hidden, something menacing. Kneeling to look closer, my hand brushed something cold, brittle, a medallion old, weathered. Inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize, but the intricate design sent shivers down my spine. I pocketed it, not knowing it was a token, a marker on a path to something cursed. Night in the outback. Stars exploded across the sky, vast, beautiful, intimidating. I sat on the porch, medallion heavy in my pocket, journal open. Silence, thick and deep, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ghost gums. Then I heard it, a soft, haunting melody riding on the breeze, like a lullaby at first, but the tone disturbingly familiar. I followed the sound, drawn away from the cabin's fragile safety, until I reached a rocky outcrop. And there, in the dim starlight, I saw her. Reflection was my first thought. Mirror image, same dark hair, deep-set eyes, but something was horribly wrong. Her eyes were cold, empty. Her smile a cruel twist of my own. Later, I learned the stories. Zara, they called her. The evil twin. Whispered legends, hushed tones. No name of her own, just the dark echo, haunting those who dared disturb the cursed ground. Zara wasn't a trick of the light, not a figment of my imagination. She was real, malevolent, forceful. Back in the cabin, days blurred. Her presence was everywhere. Fleeting glimpses in window reflections, shimmering heat haze. Always at the edge of my vision, a few steps behind. Nights were restless, nightmares filled with her taunting whispers, echoing my own darkest secrets. Stress, isolation, tricks of the mind. I tried to tell myself, but a primal terror was taking root. My unease ratcheted up when Dr. Eris Thorne arrived. Folklorist, archaeologist, renowned for her work on outback legends. Her visit was supposed to be collaboration, a chance to dive deeper into the myths. Eris was sharp, methodical, no nonsense, a stark contrast to my own unraveling emotions. Initially, she brushed off my Zara sightings as hallucinations, desert-induced. But as she started documenting the strange symbols, the evidence of violent histories etched into the landscape, her skepticism started to crack. One afternoon, Kaylin and I were trekking deeper into a gorge. We stumbled upon a ghastly scene. Narrow, winding path, scattered belongings in the dirt. Half-buried wallet, broken watch, tattered clothes. Trail ended abruptly at a shallow grave. Partial remains visible, my heart hammered. Not random. Not the desert's harshness. Something sinister. Blood-stained earth, the grim finality of the remains' violence, cruelty. I documented everything with my camera, desperate for evidence, for answers to the legends, to my own mounting horror. Kaylin changed after that day. His stories grew darker, more insistent. Secretive phone calls, hushed tones, words I couldn't catch. Eyes darting away when I asked about the past, about cursed twin spirits. My unease about him deepened, but I clung to the hope that his local knowledge was my lifeline in this darkness. Twilight bleeding into night. Alone in the cabin. Temperature plummeted. Lights flickered. Mirror. Zara standing behind me. For a moment, I didn't know where I ended, where she began. Whispered my name, each syllable laced with malice, with a chilling familiarity. Stumbled back, heart racing. Her form melted into shadow, sandy fraying. Frantic notes in my journal, desperate to record it all before I lost it completely. Days later, Eris called, panic in her voice, investigating ancient ruins nearby, inscriptions, symbols from the desert, linked to ritual sacrifice, a curse, bound an ancient doppelganger to anyone who trespassed on sacred ground. Zara, doomed to replicate, prey on inner darkness, consume identities until nothing was left. The ritual sacrifice, living soul, inner turmoil exploited to unleash malevolence. That night, Chloe called. Close friend from Sydney. Visiting. Curious about my retreat, my book. Spirited, optimistic. Beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. Insisted on coming to the cabin, support. Welcomed her presence. Brief reunion. Nightmare. Dead of night, Chloe vanished. Woke to find her things scattered in the hallway. Phone on the windowsill, screen cracked. Single message. They're coming for us. Hurt sank. Dread. Disappearance, not accident. Desert became a stage for escalating horrors. Zara's specter, always lurking. Rock formations, edge of vision. Every step shadowed by impending doom. Kaylin's suspicion grew. Shifting loyalties. Half-truths. More entangled than he let on. Rumors. Drug runners. Human traffic whispered among locals. Seemed increasingly likely my guide was connected. Operations, not just mundane crimes. Exploiting local superstitions, legends. Control. Fear. Fateful afternoon. Confront Kaylin. Dilapidated settlement outskirts, abandoned trailers, front for illicit activities. Face usually composed, itch with worry, phone in hand, demanded answers. Secretive calls, disappearances, eyes flashed, guilt, diffambouche. Rudd-looking men, intentions clear, not friendly chat. Escape. Keelan led the way, labyrinth of backtracks, heart pounding, gunfire shouts echoing. Betrayal cut deep. Kalen's voice, usually pragmatic, trembled, coursed. Local criminals. Exploited his knowledge of the outback, wanted to lash out, no time, dangerous network. Preying on vulnerable. Sight set on me. Unthinkable. Moonless night. Desert's wrath converged. Aris. Deciphering inscriptions. Victim. Sinister transformation. Cabin. Wrestling with torrent of emotions. Clues. Blood-curdling scream shattered silence. Raced outside a scene-defied explanation. Dupra. Murrit's earlier. Rational alliance. I Volsing kneeling back. Possessed. Force beyond control. Blurred line. Nightmare. Reality. Figure emerged from darkness. Zara. Form and distinct shifting. Unholy influence. Possessed Eris. Lethal intent. Horror. Watched. Eris attacked Ranger Jed, solitary rancher, offered shelter guidance. Agony Cryoko. Collapsed crimson stain, weathered clothes, once strong protective, crippled, violent, inexplicable assault. Too much pulled Eris away, shook her freemage done, Jed motionless, disbelief. Chaos. Possessed Eris, mind lost. Maelstrom of dark visions, mumbled incoherently, rituals, sacrifices, impending doom, inner turmoil. K. Unleashing Zara completely, words icy blades, portent of doom. Nightmare. Closed disappearance loomed. Clutched her phone. Writing cryptic message. They're coming for us. Terror and voicemail haunted me. Closed fate intertwined with ancient curse. Sacrifice. Completing ritual. Binding Zara to this Forsaken land. Situation escalated. Local law enforcement. Strangely silent. Undercover FBI agent. Presence supposed to bring clarity. Instead, containing situation. Small team. Cover obfuscating evidence. Conspiratorial tone. Some things better left undisturbed. Institutions meant to protect as complicit. Weight of corruption, betrayal. Horror's not just supernatural. Human malevolence, desperate, terrified. Gather allies. Salvageable. Kalen, racked with guilt. For consequences. Vow to help. Trust fragile. Desert's unforgiving darkness. Pleaded for forgiveness. Coursed into criminal network. Tried to warn me. Words lost in fear, nagging suspicion. Involvement deeper than coercion. Climax. Terror. Desert's wrath converged. Ancient ceremonial site. Crumbling ruin. Gathering place. Rites predating civilization. Moon high. Silent witness. Eerie light. Confronted Zara. Final desperate standoff. Form fluid shifting. Resembling me. Questioning reflection. Taunted relentlessly. My voice. Chewing buried secrets. Fears. Inadequacy. Consumed by darkness. Losing myself. Standochen. Breaking point. Torn. Remorse. Fear. Fateful decisions. Pressure local criminal bosses orchestrating events. Shadows. Betrayed us. Panic signaled. Unknown figures lurking. Cornered. Chaotic flurry. Shouts. Footsteps pounding hard earth. Forcibly dragged away. Desperate fight. Captors overwhelming. Undisclosed location. Dilapidated trailer. Hidden settlement outskirts. Nexus. Criminal operations. Trailer air heavy. Stench of decay. Desperation. Groom room. Barred windows. Flickering bulb. Prisoner. Supernatural horrors. Human treachery. Too much to bear. A night inner. Sound amplified. Oppressive silenced. Every moment replayed. Peaceful desert promise. Mounting unease. Uncanny footprints. Whispered voice. Chilling Zara encounters. But trust a million. Burned in pocket. Wait, curse. Clutched it tight. Found me. Find way out. Rescue Chloe. Exposed dark conspiracy. Desert graveyard of souls. Days later. Staged escape. Captor silenced me. Broke free. Hidden compound corridors. Senses alert. Sound shadow. Desert night unforgiving. Rustle of wind. Creak of metal. Heart over moment. Overed conversation. Confirmed worst fears. Local criminal network. Responsible for closed kidnapping. Colluding. Corrupt officials. Suppressed supernatural horrors. FBI agent. Once hope. Savior. Accomplishing truth hidden. Powerful interest protected. Desperation fueled. Back to ruins. Final Zara confrontation. Kalen Wade visibly shaken. Haunted confessed. Tried to help. Criminal network gripped too tight. Eyes brimmed regret. Forced to signal kidnappers. Closed terrified face. Dragged into darkness. Remorse palpable. Sliver of trust. Devised plan. Exposed conspiracy. In Zara's reign of terror. Desperate. Dangerous. Last-ditch effort. Retrieve evidence. Locate Chloe. Fate linchpin. Cursed ritual. Labyrinth of rocky outcrops. Narrow canyons. Desert conspired against us. Zara appeared. Every turn eyes gleaming malevolence. Voice whispering oblivion. Final confrontation dawn. Ancient ceremonial site, time forgotten, faced full force. Malevolent entity. Zara's presence overwhelming. Force of nature. Twisted reality. Surge of determination. Clutched medallion, plea for release. Ancient words, heiress to Stayford. Delirious state, air vibrated, palpable energy. Zara's form faltered. Flickering flame. Climactic moment. Desert winds howled. Voices of damned. Curse not just Zara. Mirror of darkness within us all. Betrayal. Kidnappings. Corruption. Reflections. Deeper insidious horror. Final burst of courage. Confronted Zara head on. Voice merged with wind howls. Demanding cycle of violence, betruggle fierce. Battle not just physical strength, wills. Keelan fought beside me. Guilt transformed. Fierce atonement. Chaos moment Zara lunged. Spectral ferocity. Regot clarity. Crumbling wall. Devastating impact. Iris fell lifeless. Eyes blankly unforgiving sky. Lost heavy blow. Fueled resolve. Chaos. Freed myself, Kalen. Compound's hidden corridors. First rays of sun. Horizon. Long, haunting Sharon land. Watch despair. Keelan. Torn past betrayals. Hope of redemption. Apprehended. Forces he served. Whispered apology. Carried by wind. Final testament. Complex men. Darkness. Light. Gather evidence. Photographs of remains. Cryptic notations. Medallion. Pulsing ancient eerie energy. Fled. Endless desert. Every step struggle. Sinking realization. Forces uncovered. Not silenced easily. Clue remained missing. Jet's fate sealed. Prayed. Exposing truth. Justice. Countless souls lost. Cursed land. Aftermath. Authorities arrived force. F. Earlier assurances hollow. Cover up. Smothered accountability. Evidence seized. Witnesses intimidated. Sinister network swept under rug. Power influence, yet truth out there. Buried deep. Red sands. Etched ancient stones. Desert. Continued her right testori. Survival. Betrayal. Eternal struggle. Darkness. Supernatural. Human heart. Desert hides secrets. Institutions erase evidence. Never forget nightmare. Single haunting reflection. Shattering illusions. Fateful October scars. Flicker of movement. Corner of eye. Reminder. Zara. Shadow born of inner demons. Still watching. Soul depths. Desert keeps secrets well. Waiting patiently. Next cell. Brave. Foolish. Disturbed cursed legacy. Leave this account. Chronicle suffering. Warning. Desert not just barren expanse. Living, breathing entity. Echoes ancient rituals. Cries lost souls. Dark reflections. Dare venture too far. Lonely beauty. Be warned. Some shadows never chased. Some reflections never meant. My name is still Ellie Carter, though some nights, staring into the abyss of the Oregon wilderness, I feel like just a shadow of that name. 35 years marked on the calendar, and November of 21 branded into my soul. I'd sought refuge in the Blackwood Forest 3 years prior, chasing silence to drown out the ghosts of yesterday. Foolish hope that was. Turns out, the real specters were waiting here. My cabin, a crude sanctuary of pine logs in desperation, stood swallowed by ancient woods, so remote it was a ghost on any map. Buck, my German shepherd, was my only constant. He was more than a dog, he was my shadow, trained for every wilderness terror a man could conjure except, it turned out, the ones that glowed from beyond the edge of reality. It began, as nightmares often do, with a hunt. Cold, brittle morning, the sun a fractured blade through the fog, turning the woods into a half-formed dream. Buck and I tracked a deer trail for hours, the silence thick, broken only by the brittle crunch of leaves underfoot. Then Buck froze. His ears went taut, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Hog, beer, my mind supply, automatic. Rifle up. Safety off, I moved forward, cautious. That's when I saw it. A shape slumped in the undergrowth, jeans and a faded hoodie clinging to it, but limbs twisted wrong. Unspeakably wrong. Living things don't bend like that. I froze, every nerve screaming. Buck whined, nose twitching, drawn to the silent horror. I crept closer, rifle raised, the air thickening with the cloying stink of copper and rot. It was a kid. 16, maybe 17, cropped brown hair plastered to his skull. Jess Price, I'd later learn. But then, he was just a thing. His face, frozen in a silent scream, eyes wide empty. Violently dead, skin on his arms ripped like claws had raked him. And the torso god, the torso. No, like something had feasted, messy and raw. My stomach bucked, bile rising. I retched behind a pine, the sauté sharp in my mouth. Part of me screamed to run, drag the body, flee. But there was only one sane path left. Call it in. Off, great, yeah, but the sheriff's substation wasn't too far. maybe 15 miles down the logging road. Blackwood was notorious for dead zones. Signal-wise, 3 miles. That's how far I had to hike back to my cabin for a single bar of service. Heart hammering, I dialed the sheriff. Waited. An hour crawled by. Then a single patrol car crunched up my track. Deputy Harding stepped out. Same bored, dismissive look I'd seen in town. Nod, more warning than greeting. We hiked back to the body. I expected shock, rage. Harding just stared. Silent, jaw tight, eyes detached. "That's Jess Price," he said, voice flat, standing over the remains. "Went missing about a week ago. Folks feared the worst." "Coroner," I said, the word thick in my throat. "People need to know." Harding cut me off. "Hold on. We'll handle this quiet. No need to rile folks up. Get the press involved. The deputy, a kid's dead. People need to be warned." He gave me a look, done with the conversation. "I'm telling you, Carter will handle it. Best you keep out of this. You live out here, maybe time to think about moving on. Before you go missing too." Something cold flickered in his eyes. Something beyond small town cop bravado. He was used to shutting things down. Phone snaps, pictures. "Call to dispatch. Stay put," he ordered, turning back to his car. "Wait." I nodded, a knees twisting in my gut. He left. No backup. No coroner. No paramedics. No forensics. Just me. There was a growing dread. That night, sleep was a battlefield. Jess's body, mutilated, flickered behind my eyelids. Buck went at the door, nails scratching wood, raccoons, possums, usual night noises. But something in my gut screamed no, don't let him out. Exhaustion finally dragged me under, only to be ripped awake by a whisper. "Ely," my name, whispered outside the cabin. Dream. Buck was on his feet, rigid, ears back, low growl. "Ella, help me." The whisper again, threading through the cracks in the walls. Flashlight, rifle, window, black, moon buried, forest swallowed by darkness. Door jerked open, beam slicing the trees. "Who's there?" My voice echoed, swallowed by the pines. Wind rustled leaves. Nothing else. Buck strained, wanting out. I held him back. Hearts pounding, we waited. Silence. Door closed, sleep vanished. Days later, Silas Blackwood showed up. Drifter, ex-con, closest thing I had to a friend in this forsaken place. Bartered supplies, shared meals, yeah. He looked like hell. Pale, jumpy. No greeting, just leaned in, whispered, "We gotta talk." Porch. Buck at my feet, ears twitching. Silas started rambling about local legends. Whispers of a thing in the forest. They called it the skin crawler. Not the devil, not exactly. Something older. Something hungry. Like a Wendigo, he said, feeding on fear, isolation. Lily, Silas's voice trembled. "I seen it, swear to God." Tall thing, half rotted, like a walking corpse. Mimics voices. Lures people away. Some say it made a deal with locals. Keep the feeding ground open. Harding's detached stare flashed in my mind. Blood drained from my face. Locals. Silas glanced around, paranoid. Ain't saying names. But I seen men in uniform out here, dragging folks away. Folks who asked too many questions. Never seen again. Silence. Jess Price. Harding's rushed to bury it. Then Silas's next words chilled me to the bone. Tried telling the authorities once. Next day, my cabin burned down. Lucky I was out hunting. "What do we do?" I asked, voice hollow, shrug helpless. "Stay alive. Get out of things hungry. And it's got help." That evening, Silas vanished back into the woods, promising to check in. Buck and I retreated inside, another sleepless night looming. Wind rattled shutters, footsteps outside. Crunching gravel, courage gathered, flashlight beam sweep in the dark, nothing. 2 days later, I found Silas again, or what was left. He hadn't checked in. Usual path. Calling his name. Forest silent, holding its breath. Buck's hackles rose, nose twitching. Then we saw at Silas's camp. Tent ripped open, shredded fabric, blood-spattered dirt. And near the burned-out fire pit, his body. Torso caved in, ribs broken outwards. Eyes wide, frozen in a mask of terror, like Jess, eerily like Jess. Heart hammered. Bile choked me. I approached. Buck barked, sharp. Twig snapped behind me. Whirled, rifle up. Between two pines, a flicker. A figure gun. Blur of movement. Rasping breath, faint echo. Combat. I'd seen horrors. But this ancient, impossible evil. Knees hit the dirt beside Silas. Trembling hand closed his eyes, vow. I'd do something, didn't know what. But I wouldn't let him rot here. Engine rumble. Distance. Ducked behind a tree, Buck silent. Pickup truck. Rolled into camp. Clytus Barlow stepped out. Poacher. Rumored to deal in worse than game. Guns, drugs, whispers of people. Glance at Silas's body. curse. Damn place, he muttered, glancing around, then a smile like he expected this. Skin crawled. Barlow grabbed a tarp, approached Celis. Help. No, disturbing calm. Spoke to the air. Got your fill, huh? No sense letting the coyotes. Chell, talk in the woods. To something in the woods, Celis's warnings. Help from locals. Criminal authorities. Couldn't watch him drag sailors away like carrion. Stepped out, rifle aimed. Buck snarled. Barlow froze. Who might you be? Smirk. Amused, not afraid. Name. Back away from the body. Shrug. Mock surrender. Easy Carter. No drama. Answers. Demanded answers. Smirk widened. Skincrawler calls the shots here. Not me. I just supply meets demand. Keep it fed, it leaves us alone. Better strangers than good folks see. Rage, confusion. You feed people to that thing. Barlow's eyes gleamed, sick triumph. Transients. Runaways, folks nobody misses. And guess what? Deputies in on it. Years. You ain't the first to figure it out, not by a long shot. Trigger finger twitched. He moved fast. Lunged behind the truck. Fired, missed. Inches. Dove into the cab. Tires spitting gravel. Gone. Tension shattered, trembling. Anger. Cursing myself. Shoved it. Buried Silas in a clearing. Stones. Wooden cross. Mind spinning. Conspiracy. How deep? Fury burned. Confront him. Force the truth. Supplies. Substation. Night falling. Harding's patrol car. Dim light. Marched inside, bucking my heel. Harding behind the desk. Resected look. File closed. Jess Price. Minimal notes, no doubt. Cold smile. Should have stayed quiet. Carter. Hand slammed desk. Found my friend. Torn apart. Cletus Barlow told me everything. What are you covering up? Harding stood slow to him. Sit down. Didn't move. Snort. Truth? Fine. Truth is, we got an arrangement with the skin trawler. Long time ago tragedies. Kids. Families. Sheriff back then deal. Drifter troublemaker. Thing gets fed. Town stays safe. No more missing locals. Except folks nobody cares about. Jess Price was a local kid. Grief, anger, sharp stab. Harding's lip curled. Stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Tried recording video evidence. No choice. Blood bordered. For the truth. Voice trembling rage. Buck snarled closer to Harding. Harding laughed, short, bitter. It wasn't me personally. Skincrawler got him first, but helped cover it up. Told the sheriff keep the heat off. You got any idea how dangerous the thing is? Don't feed it comes for us. Sacrifices Carter have to be made. Lunge across the desk. Grappled. Files radio floor. Harding strong. Head slammed wall. Vision blurred. Blood taste. Buck barked. Teeth snapping. Harding let go, fending off the dog. Scrambled up, gasping. Standoff. Desk between us. Harding hand on gun. Buck. Growling. Overhead light flickered. Radio crackled static. Scraping outside walls. Rasping breath. Window. Brought it here. Harding whispered, eyes wide. Never comes into town at window. Tall, gone hollow eyes, shining in dark. Fear. Skincrawler. Front door exploded inward thing. Impossibly tall. Flesh stretched bone tight. Mouth gape, jagged teeth. Decay stink. Harding raised a gun. Skincrawler moved. Unnatural speed. Throat. Gurgling scream. Harding's eyes rolled back. Mouth open. Voice changed. Deeper. Deepering. Soul shoved aside. Harding stood. Possessed. Black eyes. Jerked forward. Smashed me aside. Inhuman strength. Buck lunged biting Harding's arm. Possessed deputying wild. Scrambled up. Rifle. Floor. Aimed. Harding's eyes. Left emptied. Shoulder. Bullet tore. Staggered. Didn't stop. Charged. Vest. Wall. Slanted him. Rifle clattered. Buck rushed in again. Growling. Snapping at Harding's leg. This time Harding thing lifted Buck. Scruff. Through him. Room. Sickening thud. Yelp. Heart clenched. Roared. Wooden chair. Smashed. Release me. Wheeling. Adrenaline haze. Black blood. Bullet wound. Skincrawler. Looming. Puppet master possessed Harding. Dirty work. Gaze fixed. Horrifying grin. Harding advance. Dodged. Corner by knife. Floor. Overturned table. Dove. Rolled. Feet. Blade. Harding sighed. Driven deep piercing shriek. Multiple voices. Collapsed knees. Blackness drained from eyes. Tape. Breathing. Shallow. Rag. Slumped. Dead. Creature hissed. Disappointed. Vessel fail. Turn. Skincrawler. Her. Buck. Not moving. Crumpling. Healing. Cabinet. Hopeless rage. Run to him. Skincrawler's eyes locked. Lips poise. Eerily mine. Eli, you can't save them. Breath caught. Flickering like gaunt face. Sunken cheeks. Steeled myself. Foot forward. Another. Dumb being afraid. Rushed. Rushed. Creed load hands. Creature arm. Pain exploded, blood, sleeve soaked, stumbled back, gasping. Skincrawler loomed, jaws open, black saliva, free hand. Harding's gun. Floor. Grabbed. Fired 3 times, creature's torso. Scream, unnatural, walls shook. Forced myself up, staggered door, creature. No chase. Twisted, contorted black ooze. Hurt, not dead. Finish it, rumors, Wendigo things. Fire, despise fire. Substation, frantic haze, jerry can. Back storeroom, outside, no moon, no stars. Halloween, bit, back in. Pain, arm stinging, heart, buck. Soaked floors, guess. Tears blurring vision, splashed Skincrawler's twisted form, lashing out claws. Air sliced, barely dodged. Flare lit, tossed, flames rolling. Instantly, Skincrawler, bun chilling screech, fire engulfed it. Sparks, walls showered, smoke billowed, staggered outside, cuffing, tears streaming knees. Mud, exhaustion, Buck's body. Fire rage, too fast. Couldn't get back inside. Last glimpse, Stagekin's crawler, thrashing, flames shrieking, building collapsing. Somehow cabin before dawn, arm caked half-dried blood, gashes throbbing. Another attack, eerie calm. Timer bought, next day blur road, dirt stumbling, breath, struggle, blacked out, hospital bed, IV, head pounded. 2 men. Head, body heavy. Dark suits, door, hovering, await. Approached, no small talk, clipped, formal questions, FB something off, guarded substation, fire. Creature burned, Harding dead, explained, notes scribbled, no reaction, no condemnation, no reassurance. What they knew, glances traded, wrong place, wrong time, Mr. Carter, days. Repeatedly, Clytus Barlow, others involved, everything I knew, told them, thanked me. Left, doctor, look me over. Discharge soon, no buck, no substation fire, answers dog. Skincrawler, Travis body, Jess Price's ID confirmed, told nothing. Discharged, late afternoon corridor, fluorescent buzz, nurse bag, belongings. Well, Otis turned to leave, paused. Looked, whispered, tremulous voice. Sorry, Mr. Carter, but it knows your name now. Blood ran cold, asked. Been heard off? Stark fluorescent hallway, alone, understood then. Heard it, slowed it. Maybe gun, no. FBI, whoever no one learned truth. Left Mississippi soon after, still looking over shoulder, haunted. Some can't be killed. Bullets, fire. Darkness, desperate. Friends' highest places, pine smell. Last fire flicker. Every night, Buck, Myco. My name, whispered bad voice. Survived. Tell myself, not sure. Part of me died woods. Whatever crawl, leaf river, never leave me. Knows who I am. Maybe one day call me back. My name is Alex, and I'm 24. What happened back in July of 21, deep in Blackwood Forest, still claws in my sleep. Scars and nightmares are my unwanted souvenirs, a constant, chilling reminder that it wasn't just a bad dream. I grew up thinking I was unbreakable. Cancer took my dad when I was 9, showed me how fragile everything is. Since then, I trusted only myself. Not that I think people are evil, but luck, happy endings. Fairy tales, I plan for the worst, always. So, the irony bites deep that I let my guard down that one time and paid the ultimate price. It was supposed to be a reunion, a weekend camping trip. Sam, smooth-talking as ever, was the ringleader. He roped in Ben convinced Chloe, and Chloe, with her puppy dog eyes, finally wore me down. We were tight in college, a real squad, but life after graduation scattered us. Everyone craved a rewind, a chance to reconnect. A weekend in the wilderness, miles from cell service and deadlines. Sounded idyllic in theory. One sweltering afternoon that July, we crammed into Sam's beat, up truck outside my cramped apartment in the city. Sam, all broad shoulders and a military buzz cut, flashed his signature crooked grin as he wrestled my over-pack in the truck bed. Glad you could make it, he said, his voice a low rumble. We need you there, Alex. Ben, lanky and perpetually grinning, bounced out of the passenger seat. His grin was almost unsettling, never quite reaching his anxious eyes. He was fussing with the cooler, double-checking our beer supply like it was gold. Adventure awaits, he yelled, gesturing me to the back seat next to Chloe. Chloe, the baby of our group at 23, was all bright eyes and restless energy, always chasing the next thrill. She had this boundless spirit that could light up a room, a stark contrast to my own cautious nature. Every time I tried to back out of the trip, she'd corner me, Alex, please. We all need this escape. And eventually I caved. We drove north, leaving the city sprawl for winding back roads. Soon, I was half convinced we were hopelessly lost. Sam, our self-proclaimed wilderness expert, swore he'd found the perfect, secluded spot on some obscure online forum. No reindeers, no crowds, no fees. That last part should have screamed "Freed flag," but we were too caught up in the excitement to notice. On the way, we stopped at a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since my grandparents were kids. An old-timer, skin like dried leather and hair like wisps of smoke, stood behind the counter. He eyed our gear backpacks, sleeping bags, enough supplies for a small expedition. As Sam paid, the old man leaned in, his voice raspy and low. "You kids heading up near Blackwood." He shook his head slowly. "Don't go too deep. Some places they ain't safe." "Yeah, we'll keep that in mind," Sam replied, polite but dismissive, trying to brush him off. The man's pale, unsettling eyes slid over each of us in turn. "You think I'm talking about bears and coyotes? I ain't." He leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of mothballs. "Stick to the marked trails, or you might wander somewhere you shouldn't be." I remember rolling my eyes at Ben, thinking, small town weirdo trying to spook the city kids. We left the station with a fresh bag of chips and a prickle of unease that I tried to ignore. We laughed it off as local color, weird folklore. But that was red flag number 2, waving frantically, and we just kept driving. The initial drive into Blackwood was deceptively beautiful. Towering trees formed a cathedral overhead, sunlight dappling through the leaves, the air thick with pine and damp earth. But after a few miles, the paved road dissolved into a rutted dirt track. Sam slowed to a crawl. The GPS on Ben's phone flickered and died, and the tattered paper map Sam had ripped from some dusty tourist brochure showed trails that seemed to have vanished decades ago. Finally, we stumbled upon an overgrown clearing just off a barely there trail, barely wide enough for Sam's truck. "We're here," Chloe announced, ever the optimist. I watched as Sam parked in the knee-high grass. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. No ranger station, no designated campsite, just a hidden pocket swallowed by the woods. "Are you sure this is the right place?" I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. Sam shrugged, forcing a smile. "Closest to what the forum said. Come on. It'll be an adventure." We set up camp near a cluster of ancient pines. By the time we wrestled the tents into place, the sun was bleeding into the horizon. That familiar unease settled deeper in my gut. I always get edgy in unfamiliar places. Chloe, oblivious, was already excitedly gathering twigs for a fire. Ben cracked open a beer, and Sam rummaged in the cooler for snacks. I tried to shake off the dread as we swapped college stories, cracked jokes about old professors, and teased each other. But the silence kept pulling at me. Usually in a forest, you hear something: birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. Here it was stifling, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Our first real sign that something was deeply wrong came after midnight. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers. Ben was midway through a ridiculous story about a Kerr's dorm room when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. His usual grin vanished. We all went silent, listening. I caught the faintest sound, like someone whispering, then a rustling, scurrying through the underbrush. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. Sam clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, hitting the tree limb. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ben forced a laugh, but it came out thin and shaky. "Yeah, or a really gossipy possum." We kept the jokes going, clinging to them like lifelines until we felt marginally safer. Eventually, we crawled in our tents, the silence of Blackwood forest pressing in around us. The next morning, sleep offered no escape, just a restless blur punctuated by phantom whispers. I woke before dawn, the forest still shrouded in a heavy, pre-light gloom. Sam was already up, poking at the cold campfire ashes, his face etched with a pale wareness. "Couldn't sleep," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Had this weird dream about that old shack." We exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement that weird dreams were the least of our worries. Before we could say more, Ben stumbled over, yawning wide, but his usual cheer was forced. "Yo, Sam," he said, his voice tight. "Can you come with me? I want to scout for a water source. Think we're running low." Something in his tone felt off, too urgent, too strained, but I let it slide. As the guys disappeared into the trees, Chloe and I were left alone at the campsite. She started folding her sleeping bag, her movements jerky and quick. I got the strangest feeling last night. she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leak, someone was standing right outside my tent, just breathing." Her eyes were wide, reflecting the dim morning light, and a tremor ran through her hands. I tried to offer a reassuring smile, a dismissive laugh, but the words felt hollow even to my own ears. We were all ignoring the giant, shadowy elephant in the forest. Something was definitely, terrifyingly wrong out here. Hours crawled by, the sun climbing higher, but Sam and Ben remained missing. Chloe and I exchanged increasingly anxious glances. Finally, we couldn't take the waiting anymore. "We should go look for them," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. We followed the faint trail they'd taken, leading deeper into the woods. The path twisted and turned, the silence amplifying with every step. We reached a shallow stream about half a mile from camp. No sign of them. "We should head back," Chloe said, her voice trembling slightly as she scanned the dense undergrowth. I nodded, relief washing over me for a moment. But as we turned to retrace our steps, something snagged my eye, a torn scrap of fabric clinging to a low, hanging branch. It was unmistakable, a piece of Sam's plaid shirt. My stomach plummeted. "They might have gone further in," I said, the words catching in my throat. Logic screamed at me to turn back, to get out of Blackwood while we still could. But the thought of Sam and Ben, alone and possibly in trouble, I couldn't just abandon them. We pressed on, deeper into the suffocating silence, calling their names until our voices were hoarse. The woods just swallowed the sound, offering no reply. We almost missed it. Hidden by a curtain of overgrown grass, swallowed by the encroaching woods, was an old well, and beside it, lying half concealed in the tangled weeds, was Sam's flashlight. A few feet further, incongruous and chillingly out of place, lay one of his hiking boots, laces undone, as if it had simply fallen off. Chloe picked up the boot, her hand shaking so violently I thought she might drop it. "Oh my God, Alex," she whispered, her face draining of color. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just an abandoned boot in the middle of nowhere. Its owner vanished. Fear, cold and sharp, seized my chest. Sam was ex-military, tough, resourceful. If something could take him, a sudden rustle in the underbrush sent us spinning around, hearts leaping into our throats. "Sam! Ben!" We called, our voices cracking with desperation. Silence. Just the oppressive, watchful silence of the forest. A slight breeze rustled the leaves overhead, a sound that felt mocking in its normalcy. I grabbed Chloe's hand, my fingers digging into her skin. "We need to go back," I said, the words barely a breath. Back at the campsite, we found Ben, alone. He was pacing in frantic circles like a caged animal. When he saw us emerge from the trees, relief flooded his face, quickly replaced by a fresh wave of panic. "Where's Sam?" I demanded, my voice tight with barely suppressed terror. Ben swallowed hard, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool shade. "Well, we split up to look for a good water source," he stammered, his eyes darting around the campsite as if expecting something to jump out of the trees. Then we got separated. "I can't find him. He just vanished." A Chloe's voice trembled, barely audible. "He left his flashlight and a boot behind." Ben's face went slack, his eyes wide with disbelief. That doesn't make sense." He shook his head faster and faster. Again, I heard him shout once, but it was distant. By the time I got there, he was gone. We bombarded him with questions, desperate for answers, for anything that made sense of this nightmare. But Ben had nothing more to give. He was a broken record of fear and confusion, teetering on the edge of a full-blown panic attack. Finally, I cut through his rambling. "We have to search for him," I said, my voice cold and sharp, masking the terror churning inside me. "He could be hurt." Ben nodded, his eyes pleading. Chloe, however, was shaking her head, her face ashen. "We should call the authorities," she whispered, pulling out her phone, her hand trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Blank screen. "No signal," she choked out. Ben tried his phone too, nothing. Dead air. Maybe the truck," Chloe suggested, her voice laced with a desperate hope. We stumbled back to the truck, the dread growing with every step, and then we saw it. The left rear tire, flat, slashed. Jagged tears ripped through the rubber. Someone had done this, intentionally. The air around us crackled, electric with fear. We were trapped. We wasted the rest of the day screaming Sam's name into the indifferent woods, fanning out in desperate search patterns, always returning to the ravaged campsite, a grim anchor in our growing nightmare. Ours bled into each other, marked only by the deepening shadows and the knowing emptiness of our search. No sign of Sam. Just as the last sliver of sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood oranges, Ben's voice, raw and strained, sliced through the oppressive silence. "Guys over here." Chloe and I scrambled towards his voice, our hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against our ribs. We found him standing rigid, staring up into the branches of a gnarled oak. My stomach twisted into a painful knot at the sight. A body, partially decomposed, swaying gently in the evening breeze, tied upright against the tree trunk with thick loops of barbed wire. The wire bit deep into the bloated flesh, a grotesque tapestry of decay and violation. The face of there was no face left. Skin peeled away in strips, revealing a macabre grin of teeth, bone gleaming in the fading light. The clothes, what remained of them, were tattered rags, the original color lost to rotten time. Chloe gagged, stumbling back, retching violently into the undergrowth. Ben stood frozen, hands shaking uncontrollably. Fu who would do this, he whispered, his voice barely audible, a tremor running through him. A wave of nausea slammed into me. I'd seen death before in sterile hospital rooms, peaceful in its finality. But this was obscene, a desecration. It was too far gone to identify, but the implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident, not an animal attack. This was deliberate, calculated murder, and if the killer was still out here, we have to get out of here. Choked out, my throat tight with panic. Sam could still be alive, but oh God. Chloe, tears streaming down her face, nodded mutely. What if he's next? Ben just stared at the gruesome spectacle, shell-shocked, unresponsive. We can't just abandon him. He finally stammered, gesturing weakly at the corpse. We won't, I said, forcing a firmness into my voice I didn't feel. I had no idea how we'd save Sam or ourselves, but panic was a luxury we couldn't afford. But we need to be careful. I forced myself to approach the horrifying display, my gut screaming at me to run, to look away, to pretend this wasn't real. I had to find something, anything that could help us. Some clue in this member tableau. The barbed wire was cinched tight around the trunk, digging into the bark. Flies buzzed around the exposed flesh, a sickening symphony of decay. My eyes burned, my head swam. But I made myself search for a wallet, a phone, anything. Nothing. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stumbled back, heart pounding, bile rising in my throat. We have to get to the authorities. I managed, my voice ragged, but the slashed tire. Ben let out a shaky breath, a flicker of something like resolve in his eyes. We can change it. I brought a spare. We scrambled back to the truck, half expecting to find the killer waiting for us, lurking in the shadows. The air itself felt charged, heavy, like a storm about to break. But nothing moved. Ben knelt beside the truck, his hands trembling so badly he fumbled with the jack. I can't believe this is happening, he muttered, more to himself than to us. Chloe stood watch, her eyes darting nervously between the dense trees. I paced, clutching the heavy lug wrench, my mind a whirlwind of dread and adrenaline. Where was Sam? Was he alive? As I stared into the oppressive darkness of the forest, I wonder who else lurked out there, hidden in the shadows, watching us. Goosebumps prickled my arms. Just as Ben tightened the last lug nut, Chloe let out a sharp yelp, a strangled sound of pure terror. We spun around, adrenaline spiking, to see a figure stumbling out from behind a thick tree trunk. A man, dressed in torn camouflage, but it wasn't Sam. This man was older, gaunt with a matted, greasy beard. He was limping badly, one pant leg soaked crimson with blood. He collapsed at the edge of our campsite, a low moan escaping his lips. We rushed to him, instincts overriding fear for a split second. Help, he rasped, his voice weak, breath rattling in his chest. He's still out there. We tried to examine his wound, but he flinched violently, panic flaring in his eyes. Stay away, he choked out. Who did this? I asked, forcing a calm into my voice I didn't feel. We can help you. He gazed up at me, eyes wide with a terror that seemed to claw at his sanity. Elias Cade, he whispered, the name a venomous hiss. He's a killer. Been out here for years. My heart thundered in my chest. Where is he now? The man exhaled, a shaky rag breath. Shacked deeper in the woods. Truffes. He grimaced in pain, his body convulsing. He hunts people. The corpse tied to the tree. Cade's doing. And Sam, he has Sam, I murmured, the realization cold and sickening. The we have to call for help. The wounded man gave a harsh, broken laugh devoid of any humor, only despair. No good, he rasped. I tried. He cut my phone line's truck tire is everything. Then his eyes rolled back and he sagged back against the tree, unconscious or worse. Chloe knelt beside him, her face pale but determined. We need to stop the bleeding. She ripped open the first aid kit. Ben, help me get some bandages. As they worked frantically on the wounded stranger, my thoughts spun wildly, a vortex of fear and disbelief. A real-life serial killer, out here, in Blackwood, hunting people. How many had he killed? Were those Polaroid photos in the shack pictures of his victims? Did he have Sam right now? And then a shuffle in the bushes, too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. I spotted movement, a shape tall and broad-shouldered, stepping behind a thick tree. A cold wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. Ben heard it too. He snatched up the tire iron, his face a mask of stark terror. Chloe held her breath, her eyes darting wildly around the perimeter. But no one emerged. The forest fell silent again, the silence itself a threat, a promise of something unseen, something monstrous, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I clutched the lug wrench. My hands slick with sweat, adrenaline surging through me. Part of me wanted to run, to hide, to curl up and disappear. But I forced myself to stand my ground, to watch, to wait. The wounded man let out another ragged breath, then went completely still, unconscious. Finally, after an eternity that stretched into an unbearable, agonizing present, Ben spoke. His voice barely a whisper. We have to move. We can't just stay here like sitting ducks. We carefully, desperately, loaded the injured stranger into the back seat of the truck, pressing makeshift bandages against his bleeding leg. I slid into the front passenger seat, clombered him back, Ben behind the wheel. The engine sputtered, cuffed, and miraculously roared to life. We tore off down the rutted dirt path, the truck bucking and swaying wildly. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to make sense of the chaotic landscape, of where we were going, of what was happening. Ben navigated blindly, cursing under his breath as the rough terrain battered the truck. Branches scraped against the sides, tearing at the paint, as we desperately tried to find a road out, any road out. Dust billowed behind us, a ghostly plume in the twilight. At first, I thought we were making progress, putting distance between us and him. But soon a chilling realization dawned. We were going in circles. The trees all looked the same, a suffocating green maze. Every path we took dead ended in thick brush, a fallen tree, an impassable ravine. Our fear escalated, morphing into a bone-deep dread. It felt as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us trapped, ensnared in its malevolent embrace. The wounded man's breathing grew shallow, ragged. Chloe, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears, frantically tried to keep him stable, whispering desperate words of encouragement. Then the truck lurched violently. Ben swore, a string of panicked curses. We'd hit something, a hidden ditch, something that tore at the undercarriage of the vehicle with a sickening metallic screech. The engine sputtered, coughed again, and then died. Silence. Dead. Heavy final silence. No, 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 no. Ben muttered, turning the key again and again, each click met with only the mocking silence of the dead engine. Nothing. Damn it, we were stuck. Truly, utterly, hopelessly stuck. I scanned the darkening woods, a sinking feeling an absolute, crushing doom overwhelming me. Even if we could fix the truck, we were lost, directionless, trapped in this nightmare. We'd burned precious daylight, and now darkness was creeping across the sky, swallowing the last vestiges of hope. Chloe started to cry silent, choked sobs that tore at my already frayed nerves. We have to keep moving, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. 1 foot. The wounded man stirred in the back seat, his eyelids fluttering open. He rasped, his voice a ghostly whisper. He'll find you, run, hide. Then his eyes glazed over, and he went limp again. Every nerve in my body screamed to do something, anything. Sam was missing, possibly in the hands of that maniac. And we had no working vehicle, no phone signal, a dying man in our truck, and a forest that seemed determined to swallow us whole. After some frantic, whispered debate, we made a desperate plan. We agreed to try and carry the wounded man towards the main road, or at least what we hoped was the right direction. We grabbed essential supplies, water bottles, a couple of flickering flashlights, the pathetic first aid kit, and the last of our dwindling snacks. Then, with hearts pounding in our chests, we started trudging deeper into the suffocating darkness of Blackwood Forest, using nothing but gut instinct and a desperate prayer to guide us. The light was fading fast, turning the shadows long and distorted, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous figures. We moved slowly, awkwardly, half, carrying the unconscious man, his weight a dead, heavy burden. He groaned occasionally, a chilling reminder of the fragile life we were trying to save. Chloe kept checking his pulse, whispering soft, meaningless words of encouragement, as if she could somehow will him back from the brink. We hadn't gone far when a shriek ripped through the stillness. Everyone froze, paralyzed by the sheer, raw agony in that sound. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. Someone was in terrible pain. My heart clenched. Could that be Sam thinking without even a word? I thrust the wounded man's arm into Ben's hands and bolted forward, crashing through the undergrowth, drawn by that horrifying sound. Chloe grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my arm. Alex, wait. We can't just run off. I hesitated, trembling, torn. If it was Sam, if there was even a chance he was alive, I couldn't abandon him. But the wounded man needed help, and we had no idea what horrors lurked in the darkness, waiting for us. Ben squared his jaw, his face grim. Chloe, stay with him. Keep him alive. Alex, you and I can check it out. But be careful. Chloe looked torn, her eyes pleading. Please don't go too far. She nodded reluctantly, fear etched on her face. Ben and I moved forward. Cautiously now, no longer running blindly, but creeping through the undergrowth, guided by the echoes of that horrifying scream. My gut twisted with every step. If it was Sam, I was terrified of what we would find. And if it wasn't, that meant someone else was dying out here, right now, in the heart of Blackwood Forest. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I've always been drawn to the quiet corners of the world. City life never quite clicked for me. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush, it all felt like a sensory overload. So, when I landed a remote research position studying geothermal activity in Yellowstone National Park, it felt like a dream come true. A small, secluded cabin became available for researchers near Yellowstone Lake, and I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin itself is rustic but charming. Think log walls, a stone fireplace, and windows overlooking a dense pine forest that stretches down to the lake's edge. It's about a mile off the main road, down a winding dirt track that my old Jeep Wrangler handles like a champ. Complete isolation, just the way I like it. The first few weeks were idyllic. Days were spent hiking through geyser basins, collecting water samples, and marveling at the raw, untamed beauty of Yellowstone. Evenings were for data analysis by the fire, the only sounds the crackling logs and the wind whispering through the trees. It was peaceful, serene, everything I'd hoped for. Then things started to get weird. It began subtly. I noticed my trash cans were missing. We have 2 large, heavy-duty plastic bins for trash and recycling, kept right outside the back door. One morning they were just gone, vanished. I figured maybe a bear had gotten into them and dragged them off, though they were usually pretty good about leaving the bins behind, just scattering the contents. But there was no scattered trash, no sign of a struggle, just empty space where the bins should have been. I muttered to myself, figuring I'd find them down the driveway or in the woods later. I didn't. I searched the immediate area, even ventured a bit into the trees, but no trash cans. It was odd, but I chalked it up to wildlife being more resourceful than I gave them credit for. I made a mental note to report it to the park rangers when I next went into headquarters, thinking they might have a protocol for rogue trash cans. The next trash collection day came and went. Still no bins. Annoying, but not alarming. I started using heavy-duty garbage bags, placing them directly at the end of the driveway for collection. It wasn't ideal, especially with the ravens and squirrels around, but it was a temporary solution. Then came the handprints. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air is sharp and clean, and the frost glitters on the leaves. I was heading out for an early hike, coffee in hand, when I saw them. On the large window beside the front door, at eye level, were handprints. Not just 1 or 2, but several, overlapping, smudged against the glass. They were clearly human-sized, but off. They were too pale, almost translucent. like they were made of dust or ash rather than dirt or grease. My heart did a little skip. Beers don't leave handprints. Deer don't leave handprints. And I certainly hadn't put them there. I live alone. I stared at them for a long moment, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. Rational Sarah kicked in. Probably kids. I told myself, even though the nearest house was miles away, and who would be wandering around my isolated cabin in the pre-dawn chill? Still, kids were the most logical explanation. Mischievous teenagers, maybe out for a late-night prank. I sighed, grabbed a cloth from inside, and wiped the prints away. They came off easily, leaving no residue. The glass was clean again, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I glanced around the empty driveway, the silent woods, the still lake in the distance. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but the image of those pale, ghostly handprints remained burned in my mind. This is Yellowstone, I reminded myself. Strange things happen in Yellowstone. Geysers erupt, hot springs bubble, and maybe, just maybe, mischievous teenagers leave weird handprints on windows in the middle of nowhere. It had to be something normal, right? The handprints bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I started locking the doors religiously, even during the day, which felt a little silly in the middle of nowhere. I also found myself constantly glancing out the windows, scanning the tree line, the driveway, the lake. Paranoia, maybe, but the feeling of being watched, of something not quite right, was growing stronger. A few days after the handprint incident, I was working late, analyzing thermal data on my laptop. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the generator and the occasional creak of the old log walls settling. It was well past midnight, and the fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Suddenly I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. Scratch, scratch, scratch. My head snapped up, my heart pounding. I froze, listening intently. Scratch, scratch, scrape. It was definitely coming from outside near the back of the cabin, close to the kitchen window. I slowly stood up, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound amplified in the stillness. Holding my breath, I crept towards the window, peering cautiously through the gap in the curtains. At first, I saw nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees against the moonlit snow, the faint shimmer of the lake in the distance. Then I saw movement. By the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing behind the cabin, a figure was moving. It was tall and slender, vaguely human-shaped, but indistinct in the shadows. It seemed to be raking. Yes, that was it. The scratching sound was the sound of a rake being dragged across the gravelly ground. Raking, at midnight, in the woods. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure was facing away from me, its head slightly bowed. It was wearing something long and dark, like a cloak or a heavy coat. And then I saw it. Long dark hair, hanging down its back, almost to its waist. It was a woman. A woman was raking leaves in the woods behind my cabin in the middle of the night. That was unusual, to say the least, especially considering there were no houses anywhere nearby, and certainly no gardens or lawns to be raked in the dense forest. I watched her for what felt like a long time, my mind racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe she was lost. Maybe her car had broken down the main road, and she was wandering around disoriented. But raking. Why would she be raking? As I continued to watch, the woman slowly turned her head, as if sensing my presence. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see her face. It was pale, strikingly pale, and her eyes were wide and dark, reflecting the moonlight like pools of ink. They seemed to fixate directly on my window, even though I was standing back in the shadows, barely visible. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through me. It wasn't just her being there, in the middle of the night, raking leaves that weren't there. It was something in her gaze, something empty, yet intense. It was like she was looking through me, seeing something beyond the cabin walls, beyond the physical world. I instinctively recoiled from the window, stumbling back into the darkness of the living room. I pressed myself against the log wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the faint scratching sound, even though I wasn't looking anymore. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The scratching eventually faded, replaced by the howling of a distant coyote, which suddenly sounded almost comforting in its normalcy. Slowly, cautiously, I peeked back out the window. The woman was gone. The woods were still, silent, bathed in moonlight. There was no sign of her, no sign of anyone ever having been there. Just the undisturbed snow, the dark trees, and the unsettling quiet of the Yellowstone night. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent shivers down my spine. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, I felt exhausted, drained, and profoundly uneasy. I needed to talk to someone. I needed to tell someone what was happening. But who would believe me? Missing trash cans, ghostly handprints. A woman raking invisible leaves in the dead of night. It sounded insane even to my own ears. Still, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something was happening here, something strange and unsettling. And I had a feeling it was only just beginning. The next morning, despite my unease, I knew I had to get to work. Data collection waited for no one, not even ghostly women with rakes. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so I made sure to check all the locks before I left, even the seldom used deadbolt on the front door. My research site was about a 45-minute drive deeper into the park. As I drove, I replayed the events of the past few days in my mind. The trash cans, the handprints, the woman each incident. On its own could be explained away. But together, they formed a pattern, a disturbing puzzle I couldn't quite piece together. When I arrived at the ranger station later that day, I decided to casually mention the missing trash cans. Maybe someone had seen something, or maybe it was a more common occurrence than I thought. The ranger on duty, a friendly woman named Emily with a name tag that read Ranger Wilson, listened patiently as I explained. Missing trash cans, she said, tapping a pen against her desk. Beers are usually the culprits, but you said there wasn't any scattered trash. No, nothing, I confirmed. Just gone. Both of them. Ranger Wilson frowned slightly. That is a bit odd. We haven't had any reports of bear activity in that sector recently, and like you said, they usually make a mess. Did you check thoroughly around the area? Wes, I did. Pretty extensively. She leaned back in her chair. Well, sometimes people misplace things. Maybe the wind blew them further than you thought, or another researcher borrowed them by mistake and forgot to return them. She offered these explanations with a clear lack of conviction in her own voice. It's possible, I guess, I said, though I highly doubted either scenario. I just wanted to report it in case it was something unusual. Appreciate it, Ranger Wilson said, making a note on a pad. We'll keep an eye out. Anything else? I hesitated. Should I mention the handprints, the woman? It all sounded so unbelievable when spoken aloud. I didn't want to sound like a crazy person, especially not to someone in a position of authority. No, that's it for now, I said, forcing a smile. Thanks. You take care out there, Sarah. Ranger Wilson said, returning the smile. It's beautiful out there, but I can get a little isolated. There was a slight emphasis on the word, isolated, that I couldn't quite decipher. Was it just friendly concern or something else? Back at the cabin that evening, the isolated comment echoed in my mind. Isolated. That's exactly what it was. Beautiful isolation, yes, but isolation nonetheless. And in isolation, strange things can be amplified, magnified by the silence and the shadows. I decided to do some investigating of my own. If no one else was going to take the weirdness seriously, I would. I started with the trash cans. I went outside with a flashlight and systematically searched the area around the cabin again, this time expanding my search radius. I checked down the driveway, deeper into the woods behind the cabin, even along the edge of the lake, as far as I could safely go in the fading light. Nothing. No trash cans. It was as if they had been plucked from the earth, leaving no trace. Frustrated, I returned to the cabin. I needed a different approach. I thought about the handprints. They were on the front window, facing the driveway. If someone had come up the driveway to the cabin, they would have been seen from the road. But the road was rarely used, especially at night. Then I remembered the woman. She was by the lake behind the cabin in the woods. The woods stretched all the way down to the lake shore. Could she have come from the lake? It seemed unlikely. The lake was freezing cold this time of year, and there were no trails leading directly from the lake to my cabin, at least not that I knew of. But what if there was a path I hadn't discovered yet? What if she wasn't using a path at all? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my heavy coat and boots. It was getting dark, but I needed to see the lake shore behind the cabin. I needed to see if there was anything there, Anything that could explain the woman, the handprints, the missing trash cans. Armed with a powerful flashlight, I ventured out into the woods behind the cabin. The trees were dense, the undergrowth thick with snow, covered bushes and fallen branches. The air was biting cold, and the silence was almost deafening. Every snap of a twig under my boots made me jump. As I pushed through the trees, the ground began to slope downwards. Soon, I could hear the faint lapping of water against the shore. The trees thinned, and I emerged onto the edge of Yellowstone Lake. The lake stretched out before me, vast and dark, reflecting the last sliver of the setting sun like a sheet of obsidian glass. The air here was even colder, the wind whipping off the water, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I scanned the shoreline with my flashlight. Frozen pebbles, snow-covered rocks. Gnarled tree roots reaching down to the water's edge. Nothing unusual. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the snow except my own. Disappointment washed over me. I had hoped to find something. Anything to make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing, just the cold, silent lake and the deepening shadows of the forest. As I turned to head back, my flashlight beam caught something glinting in the snow near the water's edge. I moved closer, curious. It was small, metallic, half buried in the snow. I bent down and brushed the snow away. It was a trash can lid. One of mine. The bright blue lid from my recycling bin, slightly dented and scratched, but unmistakably mine. My heart leaped. Finally a clue. But as I looked around, searching for the rest of the bin, a new wave of unease washed over me. Why was it here by the lake? How had it gotten here, so far from the cabin, without leaving any trace? And more importantly, why just the lid? Where was the rest of the trash can? And then I saw it. Just beyond the lid, partially submerged in the icy water, something else glinted in the flashlight beam. Something pale, almost white, just beneath the surface of the dark water. My breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped closer to the water's edge, my flashlight beam fixed on the submerged object. The icy wind whipped around me, carrying the faint, chilling whisper of the lake. And as I leaned closer, peering into the dark, frigid water, I finally saw what it was. It wasn't just something pale. It was something pale and humanoid. Submerged just beneath the surface, barely visible in the murky depths, was a shape. A pale, indistinct shape, vaguely resembling a woman's form, with long, dark hair flowing around it in the water, swaying gently with the barely perceptible currents of the lake. And even though I couldn't see her face clearly, even though it was distorted by the water and the fading light, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was her. The woman from the woods, the woman with the rake, the woman with the eyes that saw right through me. She was in the lake, and she was watching me. My blood ran cold. The submerged figure, the pale shape in the dark water, it was undeniably her. The woman from the woods, now in the lake, just beneath the surface. Her dark hair swaying like seaweed. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand, casting erratic shadows on the water. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee back to the cabin, lock the doors, and never look back. But a morbid curiosity, a terrifying fascination, rooted me to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape in the water. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the submerged figure began to move. Not swimming, not floating, but rising. It ascended from the depths with an unnatural grace, gliding upwards as if pulled by invisible strings. The water around it rippled, disturbed by its unseen ascent. My breath hitched. I backed away, step by terrified step, my flashlight beam still fixed on the rising form. The water grew shallower, and more of her became visible. Pale arms, long and slender, emerged from the depths, followed by her torso, draped in the same dark, shapeless garment I'd seen her wearing in the woods. Then, her face broke the surface. It was even more unsettling up close. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and stretched taut over sharp, angular features. Her eyes, those wide, dark eyes, were now fully visible, and they were fixed on me, unblinking, devoid of any discernible emotion. They were like black holes, sucking in all light and warmth. Water streamed from her hair and clothes as she continued to rise, her feet now touching the shallow lake bed. She stood there, knee-deep in the freezing water, facing me, utterly silent, utterly still. The only sound was the wind whispering across the lake and my own ragged breathing. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. Unable to speak, only able to stare into those empty black eyes. She didn't speak either. She didn't need to. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised one hand, a pale, skeletal hand dripping with lake water. She extended it towards me, her fingers long and thin, beckoning me closer. That was the breaking point. The sight of that outstretched hand, that silent invitation into the icy depths, snapped me out of my paralysis. I whirled around and ran. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches, crashing through the undergrowth, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly through the trees. I didn't stop running until I burst back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and fumbling the locks, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Safe inside, or at least safer. But the image of that woman rising from the lake, her hand outstretched, was burned into my mind. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that she wouldn't stay in the lake. She was coming for me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I barricaded the doors and windows with furniture, though I knew deep down it wouldn't matter. If she wanted to get in, she would. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, clutching a heavy iron poker, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. Dawn eventually arrived, pale and weak, filtering through the gaps in the log walls. I was exhausted, terrified, and desperate. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I had to get help. As soon as it was light enough to see, I grabbed my backpack, threw in a few essentials, and fled the cabin. I didn't even bother locking the door. What was the point? I drove like a maniac down the dirt track, my Jeep bouncing and skidding on the rough terrain. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her, that pale figure, standing in the middle of the road watching me go. I drove straight to the ranger station, bursting through the doors breathless and frantic. Ranger Wilson was there, surprised to see me so early. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I have," I stammered, my voice trembling. "There's a woman in the lake by my cabin." I poured out the whole story, the missing trash cans, the handprints, the woman in the woods, the woman in the lake. Ranger Wilson listened patiently, her expression shifting from concern to something else. Something that looked like understanding. When I finished, she didn't dismiss me, didn't tell me it was just my imagination. Instead, she sighed a long, weary sigh. "Sarah," she said, her voice low and somber, I think you've encountered the weeping woman of Yellowstone Lake." The weeping woman. I repeated, my blood running cold again. Ranger Wilson nodded. "It's an old legend, a local story. They say she's the spirit of a woman who drowned in the lake a long time ago. They say she appears to people who are alone, isolated, drawn to the sadness and solitude. And she steals trash cans and leaves handprints." I asked, my voice laced with disbelief and a desperate hope for a rational explanation. Ranger Wilson shook her head. "The trash cans, that's new. The handprints, some say she leaves them as a sign, a warning. But the lake of the lake is her domain. They say if you see her in the lake, beckoning you." She trailed off, her gaze distant. "Beckoning me." I whispered, the image of that pale hand flashing in my mind. What happens if someone goes to her? Ranger Wilson looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. They say they never come back." A chilling silence filled the ranger station. The truth, or at least the legend, hung heavy in the air. The missing trash cans, the handprints, the woman in the woods, the woman in the lake, it all clicked into place, forming a terrifying, inexplicable whole. I didn't stay in Yellowstone. I packed up my research, requested a transfer, and left within days. I couldn't shake the feeling of those black eyes watching me, even miles away, even in the crowded city I'd once disliked. I still think about the weeping woman of Yellowstone Lake sometimes, especially when I see a lake or when the wind whispers through the trees. I think about her pale hand, beckoning me into the dark, icy water, and I know with a shiver of lingering fear that some mysteries are best left undisturbed, some depths best left unexplored. Some houses, no matter how beautiful or secluded, are just too close to the lake. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and I'm a seasonal park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. Most of my days are filled with the usual tourist interactions, trail maintenance, and the occasional wildlife sighting. Yellowstone is beautiful, majestic, but also vast and sometimes unsettling. You can get lost out here, truly lost, not just geographically, but in a way that feels deeper, like the wilderness swallows pieces of you whole. It was during a routine patrol in a less traveled section of the park, near the Obsidian Creek Trail, that I found it. An old wooden cabin tucked away in a dense cluster of pines far from any marked trail. It wasn't on any park maps, and I'd never heard mention of it in any ranger briefings. Curiosity, a park ranger's most reliable companion and sometimes worst enemy, pulled me towards it. The cabin was small, maybe one room, with a single heavy wooden door. The windows were boarded up from the inside, or at least it appeared that way from the thick layers of dust and grime coating the glass. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I tried the door, expecting it to be rotten and give way. It was solid, unyielding, locked. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness of the woods. Silence. Just the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of Obsidian Creek. I tried again, louder this time. "Park Ranger, is anyone inside?" Still nothing. I circled the cabin, peering through the cracks in the boarded windows. Darkness. An unnatural, heavy darkness that seemed to absorb all light. There was a palpable sense of wrongness about this place, a coldness that seeped into the air around it. I should have radioed it in, marked it on my GPS, and left it for the higher-ups to deal with. But something held me there, an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, a whisper in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me walk away. Against my better judgment, I decided to try and get inside. I wasn't equipped for forced entry, not on a routine patrol, but I figured I could at least try to pry one of the boards off a window. As I reached for my multi-tool, I heard it. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A sound from inside the locked cabin. A whimper. The whimper was soft, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. It was definitely coming from inside the cabin. My ranger instincts kicked in, overriding the creeping unease. Someone could be hurt, trapped. I had to get inside. I pulled out my multi-tool and started working on the boards covering the window closest to the door. The wood was old and weathered, but stubbornly resistant. It took me longer than I expected, the silence punctuated by the grating sound of metal on wood and my own increasingly ragged breaths. Finally, with a groan, one of the boards splintered and came loose. I ripped away the remaining fragments, creating a small opening just large enough to peer through. The darkness inside was even more profound than I'd imagined. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to press against the glass. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, slowly, my eyes adjusted, and shapes began to emerge from the gloom. It was a single room, sparsely furnished. A cot in the corner, a small wooden table, a bucket in another corner that I didn't want to think too much about. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed. And then I saw her. In the center of the room, huddled on the floor, was a girl. She was small, frail, and impossibly pale. Her clothes were ragged and dirty, hanging loosely on her thin frame. Her hair was matted and tangled, obscuring her face. She was curled up, knees to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. "Hello," I said again, my voice softer this time. "Can you hear me? I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." She stopped rocking. Her head slowly lifted, and she turned towards the window. Strands of hair fell away from her face, revealing eyes that were wide, dark, and empty. They weren't focused on me or on anything in the room. They seemed to stare inward, into some private, terrifying abyss. For a long moment she just stared, unblinking. Then she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, raspy and weak, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Help," she croaked, the word catching in her throat. It wasn't a question, but a statement devoid of hope or expectation. "Yes," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm going to get you out of there. Can you tell me your name?" She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting away from the window and back into the darkness within the room, or perhaps within herself. Another long silence stretched between us, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the pines outside. Then, in that same fragile whisper, she spoke again. "I don't remember," she said. "You don't remember your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring, even though a cold dread was starting to creep into my own mind. "That's okay. We'll figure it out. Can you tell me how long you've been in there?" She just shook her head slowly, her eyes still unfocused. "Long time," she whispered, Always dark, always dark, I repeated, glancing around the cabin again. Even with the boarded windows, some light should have been filtering through. Unless she had been in here for a very, very long time. A terrifying thought began to form in my mind. Are you hurt? I asked. Are you hungry? Thirsty. She didn't respond for a moment, then her hand, thin and skeletal, moved slowly to her stomach. Hungry, she whispered. So hungry. Okay, I said, trying to sound decisive even though I was starting to feel overwhelmed. I'm going to get you out of here. Just stay there, okay? Don't move. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I needed to call for backup, for medical assistance. This was way beyond my pay grade. But I couldn't just leave her in there, not now that I knew she was alive. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking slightly. As I was about to press the transmit button, I hesitated. What would I say? Found a girl in a locked cabin in the woods, doesn't remember her name, says she's been there a long time. It sounded insane. And what if, by some miracle, she was telling the truth? How long had she been locked away, forgotten? Every second counted. Instead of calling it in, I made another, perhaps even more questionable decision. I'll be right back. I told the girl through the window opening. I'm going to get some food and water. And then I'll get you out, I promise. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and ran back towards the trail, towards my patrol vehicle, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. I had emergency rations in my vehicle, water, a first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I ran, I couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes, that whisper of a voice. Always dark. It echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. What had happened in that cabin? Who was this girl? And what was the secret that was locked away there in the heart of the Yellowstone wilderness? I reached my vehicle, grabbed the emergency supplies, and started back towards the cabin, moving as fast as I could. The woods seemed darker now, the silence heavier, the shadows deeper. It was as if the cabin itself was exerting some kind of influence, a malevolent presence that was seeping into the surrounding forest. When I got back to the cabin, the opening I'd made in the boarded window seemed to stare back at me like a dark, accusing eye. I approached cautiously, calling out softly, "Hello, it's me, the park ranger. I'm back." Silence. I peered through the opening again. The girl was gone. Gone. She was just gone. One moment she was there, a fragile whisper in the darkness, and the next the cabin was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. Panic flared, hot and sharp. "Hello," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Girl, are you still there?" I scrambled to widen the window opening, ripping away more boards until I could squeeze through. I tumbled into the cabin, landing hard on the dusty wooden floor. The air inside was cold, stale, and carried a faint, musty odor that made my stomach churn. The room was exactly as I had seen it, except empty. The cot, the table, the bucket, all there, undisturbed. But no girl. "This isn't funny," I yelled, my voice echoing in the confined space, laced with a tremor of fear I couldn't quite control. I searched the small cabin frantically, looking behind the cot, under the table, even checking the bucket, though I knew, logically, it was impossible for her to have vanished into thin air. There was nowhere to hide. The door was still locked from the outside, the windows still boarded, save for the opening I had created. I ran to the door, fumbling with my keys, my hands clumsy with adrenaline. I unlocked it, threw it open, and burst out of the cabin, scanning the surrounding woods. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the relentless silence of the wilderness. "Girl," I called again, my voice hoarse. "Where are you?" Only the rustling leaves answered. It was as if she had never been there at all, a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light and shadow in the isolated cabin. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had seen her, heard her. That whisper, always dark. Shivers ran down my spine despite the exertion of my frantic search. This was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. I pulled out my radio, my hand no longer shaking, now cold and steady with a chilling certainty. Ranger Jenkins to dispatch emergency situation. Requesting immediate backup and medical assistance at Obsidian Creek Trail. Coordinates. I rattled off my location, my voice professional, detached, masking the turmoil inside. Backup arrived quickly, sirens wailing incongruously in the serene forest. Other rangers, paramedics, and even park police swarmed the area. The cabin became a scene of controlled chaos, flashlights cutting through the gloom, hushed voices, the crackle of radios. They searched the cabin, The surrounding woods, even Obsidian Creek itself, they found nothing. No sign of the girl, no footprints, no trace of her existence beyond my initial report. The cabin itself yielded few clues. Dust samples, wood analysis, all came back inconclusive. It was old, abandoned, as I had initially assessed. No signs of forced entry, no indication of recent habitation, except for the opening I had made in the window, and the lingering feeling of cold dread that permeated the air around it, a feeling that even the seasoned park veterans couldn't quite dismiss. Days turned into weeks. The investigation stalled. The girl in the locked room became a local legend, a whispered story among the rangers, a chilling campfire tale. Some speculated I had imagined it. Stress, isolation, the wilderness playing tricks on my mind. Others believed something more sinister had occurred, something the woods had swallowed whole, leaving no trace. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the girl was real. She was out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. Sometimes late at night, when the wind howled through the pines outside my cabin window, I would hear it. A faint, chilling whisper carried on the breeze. A sound that echoed in the darkness, a sound I would never forget. Always dark, and I knew with a growing unease that the darkness was spreading. Not just in the woods, but in my own mind, a cold, creeping shadow that threatened to consume me, leaving me lost and alone, just like the girl in the locked room. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. My name is Mark Olson, and the man I killed was my closest companion, David Chen. We were inseparable since freshman year of college, bound by a shared love for the wild and the unsettling. That's what brought us to Yellowstone in late October, when the summer crowds had thinned, and a different kind of visitor roamed the park, the kind that preferred the whisper of wind through skeletal trees to the cheerful gurgle of geysers. We were seasoned hikers, always seeking out the trails less traveled. This time we aimed for the Beckler region, known as Yellowstone's Quiet Corner. We wanted to experience the park's raw, untamed beauty, the kind that postcards conveniently leave out. We set up camp near an aerothermal feature called Shady Spring, a place David had unearthed in some obscure Park Service document. It wasn't on any official map, which, of course, only heightened its allure for us. The first few days were exactly what we'd hoped for. Crisp air, stunning vistas of golden meadows framed by dark pines, and the constant, low rumble of the earth breathing beneath our feet. We hiked, photographed, and felt that familiar thrill of being utterly alone in a vast, ancient wilderness. Then David started acting differently. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He'd stare into the steaming vents for unnervingly long periods, a strange, almost hungry look in his eyes. At first, I chalked it up to the solitude getting to him, or maybe just fatigue. But then came the whispers. I'd hear him talking in his sleep, low, guttural murmurs that weren't English or any language I recognized. When I asked him about it in the morning, he'd just shrug it off, claiming he didn't remember a thing. But the whispers grew louder, more frequent, and they started seeping into his waking hours too. He'd mutter under his breath while we hiked, his eyes darting around as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. The obsession with Shady Spring intensified. He insisted on spending hours there each day, claiming he felt drawn to it, that there was something calling to him from the depths of the earth. I tried to reason with him, to suggest exploring other areas, but he became agitated, almost hostile. It was like arguing with a stranger wearing David's face. Looking back, the first true crack in David's facet appeared on our 5th day. We were at Shady Spring, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and damp earth. The spring itself was a murky pool, ringed by sickly yellow moss, emitting a slow, rhythmic pulse of steam. David was kneeling at the edge, his hands submerged in the lukewarm water, a look of rapturous fascination on his face. "Mark," he said, his voice raspy. "Can you hear it?" I frowned, straining my ears. "Hear what? Just the spring, David." He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the bubbling water. "No. Listen closer. It's talking." That was the moment I knew something was profoundly wrong, and it was the beginning of the nightmare that led me to do the unspeakable to my best friend. Talking. I repeated, trying to keep my tone light, masking the unease that was starting to coil in my gut. David, it's just steam and bubbling water. Thermal features do that. He slowly turned his head, his eyes different. They were still David's eyes, brown and familiar, but there was something behind them, a cold, unsettling intensity that I'd never seen before. You don't hear it, do you? He whispered, his voice laced with a strange pity. It's calling to me, Mark. It knows my name. I stood up, pulling him gently by the arm. Come on, let's get back to camp. You're probably dehydrated. We should eat something. He resisted, his body suddenly stiff. I need to stay here. It wants me to stay. David, this isn't funny, I said, my voice sharper now. You're creeping me out, Bot. He finally relented, letting me lead him away from the spring, but the strange look in his eyes didn't fade. All the way back to camp, he was silent, his gaze fixed on the ground, muttering those unintelligible whispers under his breath. That night was the worst. I couldn't sleep. The whispers coming from David's sleeping bag were louder now, more insistent, like a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. They seemed to vibrate through the tent fabric, pressing against my eardrums. I lay there, frozen, listening to the unsettling symphony, the sulfurous scent of Shady Spring clinging to the air even miles from the thermal feature itself. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It was David. I scrambled for my flashlight, fumbling with the zipper of my sleeping bag, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shone the light on David. He was sitting bolt upright, eyes wide with terror, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. What is it? What happened? He stared at me, his chest heaving, but he didn't seem to see me. The whir inside my head. He gasped, his voice trembling. So many voices cold hungry. Voices. I asked. When kneeling beside him, trying to make sense of his terror, he shook his head, burying his face in his hands. I don't know. Just make them stop, Mark. Please, make them stop. I held him, trying to soothe him, telling him it was just a nightmare, the altitude, anything to calm him down. Eventually, he seemed to drift back to sleep, but the whispers continued, though softer now, a constant, insidious undercurrent to the night. The next morning, David was pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was weak and distant. He refused to eat, only picking at a granola bar. But when I suggested we cut our trip short and head back to civilization, he became agitated again, his eyes flashing with that unnerving intensity. No! He snapped, his voice suddenly regaining strength. We can't leave. Not yet. I need to go back to the spring, David. You're not well. You need rest, maybe a doctor, I pleaded. The spring will heal me, he insisted, his voice taking on a strange, almost reverent tone. It's waiting for me. It has promises. Promises. What promises could a muddy, sulfurous spring in the middle of nowhere possibly offer? But arguing with him was like talking to a wall. He was fixated, utterly consumed. And that's when I realized, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was happening to David, it wasn't just in his head. Something was taking hold of him, something ancient and dark, emanating from the depths of Yellowstone itself. And Shady Spring was the epicenter. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go back to Shady Spring. I couldn't leave David alone in this state, and a desperate, foolish part of me still hoped I could somehow reason with him, pull him back from the edge of whatever abyss he was teetering on. The hike back to the spring was agonizing. David moved with an unnatural urgency, practically dragging me along, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. The whispers were constant now, a low, sibilant drone that seemed to emanate from him, yet also from the very ground beneath our feet. When we reached Shady Spring, the air felt heavier, colder than I remembered. The sulfurous smell was overpowering, acrid, and the steam rising from the murky pool seemed thicker, almost viscous. David immediately went to the edge, dropping to his knees like a supplicant before an altar. He plunged both hands into the lukewarm water, a sigh of what sounded like relief escaping his lips. He closed his eyes, and a strange stillness settled over him, a disturbing calm that was far more unsettling than his earlier agitation. David, I said tentatively, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't respond. His body was rigid, unyielding. I squeezed his shoulder harder. David, snap out of it. We need to leave. Now. Slowly, impossibly slowly, he turned his head again. But this time, it wasn't just his eyes that were different. His whole face seemed altered. His skin was paler, almost translucent, stretched taut over his bones. His lips were thin and drawn back in a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing teeth that seemed sharper somehow. And his eyes, they were no longer David's warm brown. They were black. Utterly. Terrifyingly black, like bottomless pits that swallowed all light. A voice not David's voice, but something cold and ancient, rasped from his throat. He is gone, little friend. There is only us. Panic seized me, cold and paralyzing. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Who, what are you? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The thing wearing David's face chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that sent shivers down my spine. We are the earth, little friend. We are the silence beneath the stones, the hunger in the deep, and we are taking root. It raised a hand, no longer David's hand, but something elongated, almost skeletal, with fingers tipped with what looked like black obsidian claws. It reached for me, and in that moment, pure, unadulterated terror lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. I scrambled back, tripping over a gnarled root, scrambling to my feet and running. I ran as I had never run before, blindly crashing through the undergrowth. The image of those black eyes burned into my mind. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away from that thing. Behind me I could hear it moving, not running, but gliding, a rustling through the trees that was too smooth, too deliberate to be human. And the whispers were louder now, a triumphant chorus echoing through the silent woods. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed, until I collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath, convinced it was right behind me. But the rustling had stopped. The whispers had faded, replaced by the pounding of my own heart and the frantic rasp of my breath. I was alone, or so I thought. I lay there for what felt like hours, huddled beneath the skeletal branches of a pine, listening to the silence of the woods. But it wasn't truly silent. Beneath the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of a creek, there was something else, a low thrumming, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. It was the earth breathing, or perhaps something else. When I finally dared to move, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. I was miles from camp, disoriented and terrified, but one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. Not to the camp, not to Shady Spring, and certainly not to David. I stumbled through the woods, driven by a primal need to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. I hiked through the night, fueled by adrenaline and fear, navigating by the stars, the chilling whispers seemingly fading with every mile I put between us. By dawn, I reached a ranger station, a small isolated outpost on the edge of the Beckler region. The ranger, a grizzled woman named Sarah, looked at me with concern as I poured out my story, a disjointed, frantic torrent of words about whispers, black eyes, and a thing in the spring wearing my friend's face. To her credit, she didn't dismiss me outright. She listened patiently, her expression shifting from skepticism to something akin to unease as I spoke. When I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. She simply nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Shady Spring, she murmured more to herself than to me. Haven't heard that name in years. Places avoided. Local legends, legends. Of course, it always comes back to legends. I pressed her for details, and she reluctantly shared fragments, whispers of old stories, of a spring that takes things, of a darkness that sleeps beneath the earth and sometimes awakens. She spoke of disappearances, unexplained illnesses, a pervasive sense of dread that clung to the Beckler region like the sulfurous smell of the hot springs. Sarah made some calls, alerted the park authorities, and a search party was organized. I led them back towards Shady Spring, my heart a lead weight in my chest. We found our campsite deserted, undisturbed, save for the lingering scent of sulfur. We followed my tracks to Shady Spring itself, and there, kneeling at the edge of the murky pool, was David. He looked almost normal. Pale, gaunt, but recognizably David. He turned as we approached, a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite human, but not the terrifying black abyss I had seen before. It was calculating, deceptive. "Mark," he said, his voice almost David's voice, but with a subtle, chilling undertone. "You came back." Relief washed over the search party. "David." "Thank God you're all right," Sarah exclaimed, approaching him cautiously. But I knew. I saw it in his eyes, in the unnatural stillness of his posture. It wasn't David. Not anymore. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice cracking with desperation. That's not him. It's in him. They froze, staring at me, then back at David, confusion and disbelief etched on their faces. David just smiled that grotesque, unsettling smile. Mark, what are you talking about? He said, his voice dripping with false concern. I don't feel so good. I think I need help. They started to move towards him again, their skepticism warring with their desire to help a seemingly distressed hiker. I knew I had seconds. I knew if that thing got close to any of them, it would spread, infect, consume. I knew what I had to do. My hand moved almost of its own volition, reaching for the Glock tucked into my waistband. It was David's gun, ironically, the one he always insisted we carry for protection against wildlife. My hand tightened around the grip, the cold steel a stark contrast to the burning fear in my veins. I'm sorry, David, I whispered, my voice thick with tears, though I knew David wasn't there to hear me. I'm so sorry. And then I raised the gun, aimed, and fired. 6 times, point blank, into the head of the thing that wore my best friend's face. They say I saved their lives. They say I prevented something terrible from escaping Yellowstone, from spreading beyond the quiet corner. They call me a hero. But all I see when I close my eyes are David's black eyes and hear those whispers echoing in the silence. And I know deep down that even 6 bullets might not be enough to kill something that old, something that patient, something that is already taking root. And sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it calling my name from the depths of the earth, from the darkness on the doorstep of my mind. My name is Alex, and I'm 26 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last August, 2023, and honestly, it still messes with me every single day. It started when my boyfriend, Ben, suggested a weekend trip to Redwood County. He'd heard whispers about the Blackwood Forest there, famous for being creepy, and Ben was all about anything that promised a thrill. Ben was 28, built like a brick wall, and had this confidence that sometimes tipped over into arrogance. He thought there was a rational explanation for everything, you know. We'd been together for 2 years, and in that time his need for adventure had dragged me to more back of nowhere places than I could count. Me. I'm naturally cautious, maybe even a bit anxious, but I'd picked up some basic survival skills just to keep up with Ben's wild ideas. For this Redwood trip, Ben roped in 2 others, his high school buddy, Marcus, who'd done a stint in the military, and my best friend Chloe, who was obsessed with anything spooky. Marcus was 30, ex-military, and seriously capable in the outdoors. He brought a sense of security that honestly I really appreciated. Chloe, at 27, was a total extrovert, always laughing, always able to crack a joke and lighten the mood, even when things got tense. The plan was to camp deep in Blackwood Forest, maybe near the old logging trails, try to spot some wildlife, and, if we were lucky or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it, maybe get a little spooked by the local legends about, well, about something in the woods. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but Chloe was bouncing off the walls with excitement, and having Marcus along made me feel a little safer. We drove down on a Friday afternoon. It was humid, sticky, the kind of weather that just clings to you. The roads leading into Redwood County were all thick pine forests and swampy lowlands. When we finally rolled into the tiny town of Oak Cabin, it felt like stepping back in time. Faded storefronts, empty streets, and this heavy, earthy smell hanging in the air. Almost immediately, I noticed a sheriff's SUV tailing us. Ben pulled into a gas station, and the SUV parked right next to us. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped this older guy, gray hair, kind of barrel-chested, with a sheriff's badge. "We all here for the forest?" he asked, his voice rough, like he'd seen our type a million times before. City folks, legend trippers. Ben just kind of scoffed. "More like a weekend getaway," he said, all casual. "And just heard there were some good trails." Sheriff, his name tag said Hart, but just stared at us, eyes narrowed. "This ain't a playground," he grunted. "Folks go missing out there. Stick to town if you know what's good for you." "Thanks for the tip, Sheriff," Ben said, all dismissive. Marcus just shrugged. Chloe gave a polite smile, and I tried my best not to let my anxiety show as I climbed back into Ben's truck. Sheriff Hart leaned in a bit closer. "You remember what I said," he repeated, his voice lower now. "If you go out there, stay safe." His words hung in the air, and they definitely unsettled me, but I kept quiet. Ben just laughed it off as we pulled away. Just trying to scare the tourists, he said. We filled up the tank, grabbed some last-minute supplies from the dusty little gas station store, and headed out of town towards the forest. The deeper we drove, the narrower the roads got. The sun started dipping low, painting the sky in these crazy shades of red and orange that reflected off the still water in the ditches beside the road. My phone lost signal typical for these remote spots, but it still made me feel uneasy. Finally, we found a decent pull-off spot near the edge of the woods. We parked and started hauling our gear out. Towering redwood trees loomed overhead. The humidity was like a wet blanket. "This is it," Ben announced, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Perfect spot." Chloe gave this dramatic shiver. "Feels creepy already." "I love it." Marcus just grunted in agreement, all business, checking around for a good campsite. We hiked about a mile from the cars, deeper into the woods, until we stumbled on a small clearing near an old, broken-down fence. There was this rundown cabin at one edge of the clearing, roof half caved in, windows smashed. Looked totally abandoned. Perfect for Ben's idea of an authentic scare. We set up our tents close together, not too far from the cabin. By the time we got a fire going, dusk had settled in. Mosquitoes buzzed in thick clouds, and the air smelled like damp earth and rotting leaves. Chloe was already snapping pictures on her phone, giggling. Marcus was methodical, laying out supplies, rope, first aid kit, a couple hunting knives, and this old .38 revolver he always carried, just in case. I found myself unpacking flashlights and bug spray, trying to keep busy, trying not to think about the sheriff's warning. Dinner was simple, canned chili, and hot dogs cooked over the fire. Ben was in high spirits, going on about the legends of Blackwood Forest, while Chloe added all these dramatic sound effects. "These say there's something in the woods," Chloe whispered dramatically. "Something tall." "Just stories," but he was grinning. "Still, gotta admit, a good scare is nice once in a while, right? Keeps things interesting." Marcus just stared into the fire, his face serious. "I've seen enough weird stuff in my time," he muttered. "Sometimes the scariest thing you'll run into is other people." We'd soon find out just how right he was. We turned in around 10. The night insects were like a piercing chorus, and a thick mist drifted across the clearing. I shared a tent with Chloe, Ben and Marcus took the other. Exhaustion hit me hard, traveling always wore me out, but nerves kept me awake longer than usual. Eventually, I drifted off to the lullaby of frogs and crickets. A sharp snap of a twig jolted me awake. I glanced at my phone close to midnight. Chloe was breathing steadily beside me. Outside, I heard this low murmur, like a voice. I carefully lifted the tent flap just a crack, peering out into the darkness. By the dying embers of the campfire, something moved. For a split second, I thought it was Ben, but it was too tall, too thin. It swayed spindly like a shadow among shadows. I held my breath. Then, the figure just slipped away into the trees without a sound. My skin prickled. I almost woke Chloe, but decided it was probably just my imagination or a trick of the moonlight. Telling myself it was just a deer or some weird shadow play, I lay back down, eventually falling into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found Marcus examining his arm. There were these strange marks on his form 3 thin, parallel scratches. "What happened?" I asked. "No idea," he said, frowning, touching them lightly. "Could be branches," but he trailed off, looking unsure. Just then, Ben came bounding over, all fake cheerfulness. "Hey guys, found something," he said, way too enthusiastically. We followed him around to the side of the cabin. There, in a patch of soft, muddy ground, we saw a cluster of bones. Some were still partly buried, others scattered around. They looked old, but not ancient, gnawed or broken in unnatural ways. Chloe's face went white. Are those human? Ben poked at one with a stick, shrugging. "Could be deer bones," he said, but he sounded uncertain even to himself. Marcus knelt down, brushing away some dirt. He picked up something small and bone-hard. "Nope," he said, his voice flat. He held it out. It was a jawbone, human jawbone, no doubt about it. We all recoiled. Ben tried to rationalize it like always. "Could be some weird old burial site," he said. "You know, an animal bone that just looks human." He tossed the jawbone aside, refusing to admit it might be real. No reason to panic. Chloe just stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Are you serious?" We need to report this, or something. But we had no signal, no way to call anyone. Marcus carefully placed the jawbone back where he'd found it. Let's just keep an eye out, he said. Let's not do anything rash. And that was how our weekend in Redwood County really began. We carried on that day, exploring the forest on foot. But the mood had definitely shifted. The thick trees and still, dark water made it almost impossible to keep our bearings. A couple of times, I thought I saw movement in the distance, glimpses of shadows between the trees. Once it looked like that same tall, spindly figure from the night before. Marcus noticed me jump and pointed out, could be hikers, or maybe wildlife. But then we heard distant gunshots echoing faintly through the trees, which added a different kind of weight to his words. Poachers, he muttered, or illegal hunters. The real trouble started in the late afternoon. We rounded a bend in the trail and came face to face with three guys decked out in full camo gear, rifles slung over their shoulders. The way they looked at us, it sent a chill right through me. One of them wary, with a nasty scar across his cheek, just sneered. Another, tall and broad, spat on the ground right at our feet. The third guy, Jeb, had this lazy eye that never seemed to focus on the same thing as the other. Jeb sized us up and down. We're all lost, he drawled. Ben tried to play it friendly, putting on this fake smile. Just out here camping, he said. City folks, you know. The scared guy just sneered again. You need to move on, he spat. This is our territory. Marcus's jaw tightened. We're on public land, he said, his voice low and steady. All three of them just stared this cold, hard look that made my stomach clench. Finally, Jeb's lazy eye seemed to settle, sort of on Ben. Keep to your own space, then, he said, his voice like gravel. Don't wander around too much here. We backed off slowly and headed back to camp, that encounter leaving a really bad taste in my mouth. Ben tried to joke about it, of course. Just some backwoods rednecks, he said. No big deal. But Marcus looked genuinely concerned. They were scoping us out, he said quietly. Something else is going on. Chloe tried to lighten the mood by firing up the portable stove and starting dinner, but the tension just hung thick in the air, like the humidity. We debated packing up and leaving right then and there. Ben, naturally, was all about staying. If we let a few creeps scare us off, he argued, then they win. Chloe was torn. She hated confrontation, but she had come all this way for an adventure. Marcus just said we should at least think about moving to a different campsite, somewhere less exposed. But it was getting dark fast. We reluctantly decided to stay put for one more night. Looking back, that decision cost us everything. After sunset, the whole atmosphere of the forest changed. The crickets and frogs went silent, not all at once, but in waves like something was moving through the woods, silencing everything in its path. At one point, we heard this faint scream in the distance, too far to tell if it was human or animal. The darkness felt absolute, pressing in on our small circle of firelight. We all stuck close to the fire, none of us wanting to wander off alone. Around midnight, Chloe said she needed to find a private spot to pee. I offered to go with her, but she just waved me off with a grin. I'll be fine, she said. Just over there behind the trees. She never came back. We waited, at first patiently, then with this mounting dread that just kept tightening in my chest. After about 15 minutes, Marcus grabbed a flashlight. Okay, he said, his voice tight. Let's go find her. We started searching. We found her footprints leading into this small clump of cypress trees, just like she said. Then nothing. Just dead leaves and damp earth. I saw her phone, face down in the mud, the screen cracked. There was a smear of blood on the corner. No sign of Chloe. No footprints leading away from the area. Ben started yelling her name. Chloe. Chloe. His voice echoed uselessly through the trees. Marcus took the lead, scanning the undergrowth, cursing under his breath. I could barely breathe. My heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Panic was threatening to drown me, but I forced myself to focus, to just keep looking, searching for any clue. We found broken branches, signs of a struggle, drops of blood on a tree trunk high up, at shoulder height, like she'd been lifted, dragged. Still no footprints, just the cloying smell of stagnant water, and this faint, sickly stench something rotten. Marcus's jaw was set grim. He turned to Ben. We can't split up, he said. Too dangerous. Alex, stay close. We scarred the area for what felt like hours, calling Chloe's name until our voices were hoarse. Every rustle in the undergrowth made us jump. Eventually, we found a larger patch of blood on the ground, darker now, almost black in the flashlight beam. But Chloe was just gone. Fear was etched all over Ben's face. Maybe it's those hunters, he stammered. Maybe they took her. No, Marcus said quietly. He held up something small and torn, a piece of fabric from Chloe's shirt. It was splattered with mud and something that smelled metallic, blood. An animal, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe. Suddenly, this inhuman shriek tore through the night. It wasn't quite an animal roar, but it wasn't human either. We froze. The shriek repeated, closer this time, mixed with this chilling sound like laughter. My blood turned to ice. It sounded too close, like it was circling us. Run, Marcus shouted. We sprinted back towards camp, adrenaline pumping. Ben fired off a flare that Marcus had in his pack. For a brief, blinding moment, the twisted silhouettes of the redwood trees were lit up in this eerie orange glow. And in that flash, I saw it. A tall, gaunt shape perched on a low branch, staring down at us with hollow, black eyes. Then darkness again. A heavy thud made me jump, but when I swung my flashlight back, the branch was empty. I wanted to pack up. Leave now, but Marcus was adamant. We'll wait for dawn, he said, his voice strained. We can't navigate these woods at night. Ben looked like he was about to argue, but then we heard more howling in the distance, closer now. We huddled together by the dying fire, guns drawn, flashlights shaking in our hands. Chloe, I whispered, choking back tears. Ben had his arm around me, trembling. Marcus just kept scanning the darkness, his eyes narrowed, focused. Then we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, someone approaching. Ben raised his flashlight and we saw him. Jeb, stepping into the clearing. He had his rifle cradled in his arms and he was grinning when he saw us. Y'all missing someone. He drawled. Ben stood up, gun raised, his voice shaking with rage and fear. What did you do with her? Jeb just shook his head, still grinning. Aim you gotta worry about, he said. You're trespassing. We got rules in these parts. Marcus cocked his revolver, the click echoing in the silence. Where's Chloe? Jeb let out a low whistle. I figure either the woods got her by now, he said, or something else. Something, and Ben just snapped. He lunged forward, jamming the barrel of his gun right against Jeb's chest. Jeb didn't even flinch. Go on then, he said, that cruel grin spreading wider across his face. But you'll be doing my job for me. I felt my stomach twist. What do you mean? I whispered, but he ignored me, keeping his eyes locked on Ben. Rounding up city folk for my buyer, Jeb continued, like he was just chatting about the weather. There's a market out there, see. People pay good money for captives. And out here, nobody ever finds the bodies. His grin widened. Usually that thing in the woods cleans up after us. Ben's face went pale, the anger draining right out of him, replaced by sheer horror. What the hell are you talking about? He stammered. We take folks like you, Jeb said, still grinning. Hand you over to traffickers, you might say. But lately, he paused, glancing around at the dark woods. Lately, we've had competition. Something else gets to folks first. Messes with our payday. Rage cold and sharp shot through me. I glared at him. You're insane. Insane enough that you should be real scared, Jeb snickered. Then he turned suddenly, his head snapping around as a branch cracked behind him. You hear that? He whispered, even he sounded on edge now. I spotted movement near the cabin. A tall, skeletal figure with sunken cheeks, black eyes reflecting our flashlights like marbles. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and it let out this low, guttural hiss. Jeb raised his rifle, but the creature, the thing I would later learn to fear more than anything, moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. With one impossible leap, it struck Jeb, sending him crashing backwards into the fire, scattering embers everywhere. He screamed, rolling away, desperately patting out the flames on his clothes. Ben fired 3 shots. The creature jerked, then twisted its head at this impossible angle and let out another shriek. Run, Marcus roared. We sprinted towards the trees, pure adrenaline driving us. Jeb stumbled after us, screaming, but the creature caught him, yanking him back into the shadows. The last thing I saw of Jeb was his terrified face as he disappeared into the darkness, his scream cut off by this sickening crunch. We barreled through the woods in blind panic. Tree roots snagged at our ankles, mud sucked at our boots. Ben nearly tripped, and Marcus hauled him back up. We could hear that eerie laughter echoing behind us, followed by more shrieks. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Eventually, we paused to catch our breath near a half-submerged log, gasping for air. I noticed movement behind us. Marcus whipped around, gun raised. Two more armed men emerged from the trees. Poachers, or part of the same sick ring. They aimed their rifles right at us. Ben froze, dropping his gun, hands up in surrender. "Drop your weapons," one of them snarled. We did. Powerless, they marched us deeper into the woods. I felt numb, my mind racing, flipping between images of Chloe's phone in the mud and that creature's horrifying face. We're next, I kept thinking. They're going to sell us, or kill us, or the possibilities were too awful to even think about. We reached a small clearing where they'd set up a rough camp. A battered pickup truck was parked on slightly higher ground. Guns, tarps, and these ominous plastic containers were scattered around. The men shoved us down to our knees. One started patting us down, searching for valuables. Suddenly, the creature's screech echoed again, closer than ever. One of the men cursed and fired his rifle into the air. "Damn thing's still here," he growled. "Been circling all night." The tall man, who seemed to be in charge, looked around, sweat pouring down his face. "We need to move these folks," he said urgently. "Boyers will meet us by the old logging road." And one of them yanked Ben to his feet. Ben, desperate, made them an offer. "We have money," he gasped. "If you let me go, I'll show you where our car is. It's got valuables. Maybe a few thousand in gear." I stared at him, disbelief turning into this cold, sick feeling in my gut. Ben wasn't even trying to negotiate for all of us. Just himself. Tears pricked at my eyes. He was so terrified he'd do anything to save his own skin. "You serious?" the tall man said, narrowing his eyes. Ben nodded furiously. "Yeah, just let me go and I'll lead you right there." I opened my mouth to shout at him, to call him out, but Marcus just shook his head, giving me this look that said, "Let him talk. Maybe we can use this." My heart was pounding. Was Ben really abandoning us? Before the tall man could decide, it happened. The creature swooped in. I didn't see it clearly, just a flash of sickly white limbs and those hollow eyes. It crashed into one of the poachers, dragging him into the underbrush. The man's screams turned into gurgles. Then silence, blood splattered on the cypress roots. Chaos just erupted. Shots were fired wildly, muzzle flashes lighting up the swamp. Ben bolted. Just ran, leaving me and Marcus behind. The tall man tried to shoot after him, but the monster, it seemed to just appear behind him, snapping his neck with this hideous crack. I scrambled away, still bound at the wrists with a zip tie. Marcus, also bound, slammed his shoulder into the last poacher, knocking him to the ground. The rifle flew from the man's hands. The creature lunged, jaws snapping. Marcus shoved me aside, and we just half ran, half crawled away. Behind us, the monster finished off the last poacher with this wet, tearing sound. We kept going, stumbling blindly until we reached an old dirt path. My wrists burned from the zip tie as I struggled to break free. Marcus managed to find a sharp rock, and we sawed at the plastic until it finally gave way. Then we freed his hands too. Fear hammered in my temples, but I forced myself to keep moving. "Ben," I choked out, tears falling as the shock started to set in. He just ran. Marcus didn't say anything. I think he was wrestling with his own anger, the betrayal. But survival was more pressing. We stumbled on this old, half-hidden bunker, built into a small rise in the ground. The door was hanging open, rusted and creaking in the wind. Inside, it was dark and smelled like damp earth and decay. We found rotting wooden shelves, empty crates, and the single, working flashlight that flickered weakly. And then we found it. In the back of the bunker, a crate filled with old documents and files, stamped with FBI insignias. Marcus flipped through them, shining the flashlight over typed pages. They knew, he whispered, his voice barely audible. They knew about disappearances, dating back decades. He pointed to the files. All in this region, people vanish. Bodies never found. He paused, his eyes haunted. They tried to cover it up. The notes, they were insane. They mentioned a Wendigo-like entity. References to old Native American lore about cursed spirits that mimic voices, luring victims into the darkness. My hands started shaking as I read one folder. It even referenced local authorities helping to keep the story out of the press. A few scribbled notes indicated that higher-ups believed the creature should be contained, but local enforcement was uncooperative. Suddenly, we heard thrashing outside. We killed the flashlight, plunging us in near total darkness. Holding our breath, we listened. The door to the bunker let in a sliver of moonlight, and in that faint glow, we saw a silhouette pass by. It paused near the entrance, sniffing or listening. My entire body stiffened. The shape lingered, and I could almost feel its hunger. Then, after an eternity, it moved away. We exhaled in shaky relief. Marcus clutched the 38 revolver he'd managed to keep. We waited there for what felt like hours, silent, hearts pounding. Finally, when the silence stretched on too long, we dared to emerge. The forest around us was eerily quiet. We had to get back to the cars. But we also hoped we might find Chloe, or what was left of her. That guilt weighed on me heavy and cold. By the time we reached our campsite, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in streaks of pale gray and pink. The place looked ravaged. Tents shredded, gear scattered, blood splattered across the ground. No sign of Chloe's body, no trace of the monster. We grabbed whatever supplies we could salvage: flashlights, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife. As we turned to leave, I saw something propped against the cabin wall. I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. It was Chloe. Alive. Bit ruined, missing an arm. She was slumped forward, eyes glazed, breathing shallowly. Marcus and I rushed to her. She looked up, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Alex," she croaked, blood staining her clothes, her skin deathly pale. She tried to say more, but only managed a trembling whimper. I held her face in my hands, tears streaming down my face. "It's okay," I whispered, even though it was a blatant lie. She was too badly injured. She cuffed flecks of blood on her lips. "It's whispered your names," she rasped. Then her eyes fluttered, going blank. I tried desperately to find a pulse, to do something, anything, but she was gone. I laid her gently on the ground, sobbing. Marcus just shut his eyes, whispering a prayer I couldn't quite hear. We had no time to mourn properly. A shuffling sound made us bolt upright. The creature was near. We ran, keeping to the dirt path, pushing ourselves until we finally saw a faint outline of the main road through the trees. Relief spiked my adrenaline, but that's when we heard it. Footsteps behind us, ragged breathing, and then a twisted voice mimicking Chloe's last words. "Your names," it whispered. "Your names." The whisper bounced among the trees, echoing, getting closer. Finally, we burst onto the road, panting, hearts hammering. Dawnlight revealed Ben's truck a short distance away, parked on the shoulder. The driver's door was open, the engine still running. My stomach lurched. "Ben," I yelled, approaching the truck. The interior was splashed with blood. No sign of him, just torn pieces of clothing and scraps of flesh. I looked away, gagging. On the passenger seat, I saw his phone screen cracked. The keys were still in the ignition. "Let's just go," Marcus said, his voice urgent, scanning the edge of the forest. We hopped in, but the front windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, and the passenger window completely blown out, maybe from a gunshot. Or something else. Marcus tried to drive. The truck rattled and squealed, tires struggling against the muddy ditch, but he managed to get it onto the main road. As the sun rose, I just remember tears streaming down my face, a mix of horror, grief, and this grim relief that I was still breathing. About 2 miles down the road, we saw flashing lights, a sheriff's cruiser. My heart soared. Save. But when Sheriff Hart emerged, his face showed no surprise at our state. He walked over calmly, eyeing the battered truck. Marcus and I stumbled out, pleading for help, babbling about Chloe, the creature, the poachers, everything. Sheriff Hart just frowned, looking distant. "Let's get you patched up first," he said, his voice flat. We were ushered into his cruiser. I expected backup, something. Instead, he drove us slowly back to town, without a word. When we reached the station, this small, shabby building, he led us inside. I noticed a black SUV parked out front with dark tinted windows. Inside the station, 2 men in suits stood waiting. One was tall and stiff, the other bald and stocky. Sheriff Hart spoke quietly to them, and they nodded. Then the suits just escorted Marcus away, without a word of explanation. A wave of fear washed over me. "Where are you taking him?" I shouted, but they ignored me. I tried to follow, but the sheriff blocked my path. "You'll need to make a statement," he said, his voice cold. But some things are better left forgotten. I realized with this cold, sinking dread that we weren't being rescued. We were being contained. Just like the files in the bunker had suggested. This was a cover-up. They didn't want the story out. I glared at Sheriff Hart, rage and terror mixing into this potent brew. He gave me this level look, no emotion in his eyes. You and your friends, you stumbled into something you shouldn't have, he said. Be thankful you survived. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The official story will be that your group went missing in a hiking accident. Flash flood. Quicksand. Plenty of ways people disappear out here. My eyes stung with tears. Why? I demanded, my voice shaking. That thing is killing people. Why not stop it? He just sighed, looking suddenly older, defeated. We've tried, he said. It always comes back. You don't know what you're dealing with. A short time later, one of the suits returned and told me I was free to go. Marcus was nowhere in sight. I asked if I could see him, and they simply shook their heads. My heart pounded. Was Marcus gone too? Dead? A pang of guilt and anger shot through me. They practically shoved me out the door. I stumbled out into the sunlight, reeling from shock. They gave me a ride. One of the suits drove while I sat in the back seat, numb, mind racing. Finally, they left me at a local motel on the outskirts of town. I didn't bother asking questions. I knew they wouldn't answer. The man who dropped me off just said, "We have your statement. Don't talk to anyone about this." Then he drove away. I checked into a room, locked the door, and just sank onto the bed. I didn't sleep. Images of Chloe's broken body and that horrifying creature replayed in my mind on an endless loop. And worst of all, Marcus's fate was unknown. Ben was almost certainly dead. We'd all walked into this nightmare willingly, brushing off the sheriff's warnings like we knew better. In the morning, I decided I'd drive home and tell someone, anyone, what happened. But as I started my car, an old, unmarked sedan pulled up behind me. I recognized one of the suits inside, a not so subtle reminder that I was being watched. I knew then that any attempt to speak out would be silenced. Terrified and disgusted, I just drove away, tears burning my eyes. Even miles outside of Redwood County, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. My nerves were on high alert, scanning the rearview mirror constantly. At a gas station, I noticed the same unmarked sedan parked across the street. Eventually, it broke off, and I managed to reach the interstate alone. I tried to calm myself, turning on the radio for background noise. But after a few miles, I heard something behind me. A faint whisper. It was Ben's voice. Or something trying to sound like Ben. Saying, "Alex, don't leave me here." My blood froze. I nearly swerved off the road, pulling over hard onto the shoulder. Heart hammering, I checked the back seat. Nothing. Just empty space. I sat there trembling, tears streaming down my face, unsure if I was losing my mind, or if that creature's mimicry could reach me even now. I wish I could say I went to the FBI or the media. But the local FBI presence seemed complicit, and no journalist would believe a story like mine without evidence. Everything we had was taken or destroyed. I'm telling this now only because I can't bear the weight of it alone. So that's it. My name is Alex. I'm 26 years old. This happened last August 2023 in Redwood County. I barely escaped with my life. Chloe is dead. Marcus is missing. Ben betrayed us in desperation. And I don't even know if he died quickly, or if that monster kept him alive for a while. Sheriff Hart and some government suits made sure no official record would remain. But I remember. I see it in my nightmares, and sometimes, even when I'm wide awake, I swear I hear that twisted whisper behind me, calling my name in the voices of the dead. I've come to realize what's most terrifying isn't just the creature stalking the woods of Blackwood Forest. It's the people. Those who hunt humans for profit, those who look the other way, and those who will do anything to keep a secret. In the end, we discovered a horror that thrived in that place for years, maybe decades. And we found out just how far people would go to hide it. So, if you ever find yourself in Redwood County or anywhere near Blackwood Forest, remember my story. Remember that there are real monsters out there, both human and otherwise. And if you're smart, you'll stay far, far away. Because there are some places you just don't come back from. And for the ones who do, you're never the same again. I read it. Long-time lurker, first-time poster, and unfortunately, This is a story I wish I didn't have to tell. If you're looking for a reason to maybe rethink that cute cabin getaway in a national park, well, here it is. My name is Sarah, and last summer, my friend Mike and I decided we needed a break. City life in Chicago was grinding us down, and we both craved nature, fresh air, and, the whole unplugged experience. Mike, ever the planner, found this rustic cabin deep in Yellowstone National Park. Rustic was an understatement when we finally saw it, but more on that later. Mike is Mike. Picture your typical outdoorsy guy, beard, flannel shirts even in July, and way too much enthusiasm for hiking trails. He's a good friend, though always up for an adventure, maybe a little too fearless for his own good. I'm more of the cautious type, the one who reads all the reviews twice and packs extra bug spray. We balance each other out, usually. The drive to Yellowstone was incredible. Wyoming is seriously beautiful. Towering mountains, endless skies. It was exactly the escape we needed. We picked up groceries in a small town just outside the park, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. And the general store sells everything from fishing lures to homemade pie. The locals were friendly, giving us that small town smile and enjoy your stay. But there was something in their eyes, a flicker of something. I couldn't place it then, but it felt a little like pity, or maybe warning. I shrugged it off as city-induced paranoia. Getting to the cabin was another story. Mike's GPS directed us down increasingly narrow roads, then gravel paths, and finally, what could barely be called a track through the trees. Rustic, right? We bounced along in my old Jeep, branches scraping the sides. Sunlight disappearing as the forest closed in around us. It was definitely secluded, too secluded, maybe. Finally, we arrived. The cabin was old, like really old. Log walls, most covered roof, and a porch that sagged in the middle. It looked straight out of a horror movie, honestly. But it was ours for the week. We hauled our bags inside. The air was instantly cooler and smelled faintly of damp wood and something elsey, something almost metallic. I opened a window, letting in a rush of pine, scented air, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. The inside was basic, a living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Everything was dusty and a little worn, but it was clean enough. We unpacked, Mike immediately heading out to explore the trails, while I started making sandwiches for lunch. As I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dense woods surrounding the cabin, a shiver went down my back. The silence was intense, not peaceful silence, but a heavy, watchful silence. The kind where you feel like you're being observed, even though you can't see anything. The wind rustled the leaves, and a twig snapped somewhere deep in the trees, making me jump. It was just nature, I told myself, just the woods being the woods. But that feeling, that prickling uneasy, it wouldn't go away. Mike came back grinning, talking about a great trail he'd found that led down to a creek. He was oblivious to my growing anxiety, already planning our afternoon hike. I plastered on a smile, grabbed my sandwich, and followed him out onto the sagging porch. The Yellowstone wilderness stretched out before us, beautiful and vast, and for the first time truly unsettling. The hike started innocently enough. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the forest floor. Birds chirped. Squirrels chattered, all the usual woodland sounds. Mike led the way, pointing out different types of trees and excitedly identifying animal tracks in the mud. I tried to relax, to let the beauty of Yellowstone wash away my earlier jitters. The trail wound downhill, following a small, gurgling creek. The trees grew denser, the sunlight dimmer. The cheerful bird sounds faded, replaced by a deeper, quieter hum of the forest. It wasn't silent, not exactly, but the sounds were muted, like the woods were holding its breath. We reached the creek, a pretty little thing with clear, cold water rushing over smooth stones. Mike, predictably, wanted to wade in. He kicked off his boots and plunged in, whooping as the icy water hit him. I declined, content to sit on a fallen log and watch. Something about the stillness of the woods was still making me uneasy. As Mike splashed around, I scanned the trees on the opposite bank of the creek. They were thick and dark, the shadows underneath them almost black, and then I saw it. Or thought I saw it. A flicker of movement deep in the shadows. Something tall and dark, shifting between the trees. I blinked and it was gone. Just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, I told myself. But my heart started to pound a little faster. See anything interesting over there? Mike called out, dripping and grinning. Just shadows, I said, trying to sound casual. Probably just a deer or something. He shrugged, unconcerned. Probably. Lots of wildlife out here. Bears, mountain lions, elk, you name it. He said it with a thrill in his voice, but I felt a fresh wave of anxiety. Bears and mountain lions were not exactly on my list of relaxing nature experiences. We continued hiking deeper into the woods. The trail became less defined, more overgrown. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was like the trees themselves were observing us, their silent branches like judging eyes. Then we heard it, a sound that definitely wasn't birds or squirrels. A low guttural growl coming from somewhere nearby, just beyond the thick undergrowth. It was deep and menacing, sending a shiver of pure fear down my spine. Mike froze, his usual bravado momentarily gone. What was that? He whispered, his eyes wide. I don't know, I stammered, my voice barely audible. Beer. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the snapping of branches. Whatever it was big, and it was moving towards us. Okay, Mike said, his voice regaining some of its usual confidence, but with an edge of nervousness now. Okay, let's just back away slowly. We started to retreat, stepping carefully, our eyes fixed on the dense bushes where the sound had come from. The growling continued closer and closer. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my legs trembling. Suddenly, the bushes rustled violently, and something dark and massive burst out onto the trail. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was wrong. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and matted, dark fur. Its head was obscured by shadows, but I could see glinting eyes, burning with unnatural red light. It stood there, blocking the trail, its growl turning into a high-pitched, chilling shriek that echoed through the silent woods. We didn't wait to see what it would do. We turned and ran. Ran as fast as we could, back up the trail, away from the creek, away from the thing. Branches whipped at our faces, roots tripped us, but we didn't stop. We ran blindly, fueled by pure terror, the shrieking sound chasing us through the trees. We burst out of the woods, stumbling back onto the gravel track leading to the cabin, gasping for breath, hearts hammering in our chests. We didn't stop running until we were back on the porch, collapsing against the cabin walls, shaking and pale. The woods behind us remained silent. Too silent, as if they were listening, waiting. And I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever we had just seen, whatever had chased us, was not natural. And it was still out there. That was our first afternoon in Yellowstone. And things only got worse from there. We huddled on the porch, panting, staring at the tree line as if expecting it to burst out at any moment. The afternoon sun, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now felt weak and insufficient against the encroaching shadows of the forest. What was that? I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Mike was still pale, but his initial shock seemed to be fading, replaced by a kind of grim determination. I don't know, he said, his voice low. But it wasn't a bear, or anything I've ever seen before. It was tall, I whispered, remembering the impossible height of the creature, the red eyes burning in the shadows. And that sound. Yeah, Mike said, a shiver running through him. That sound, I won't forget that anytime soon. We sat in silence for a long time, the quiet of the woods pressing in on us, no longer peaceful, but menacing. The sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin and the yard. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as twilight approached. We should go inside, I said finally, the thought of being out in the open as darkness fell feeling unbearable. Mike nodded, slowly getting to his feet. Yeah, we should. We retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind us, a flimsy wooden door that suddenly felt laughably inadequate. The inside of the cabin was dim, the late afternoon light barely penetrating the dusty windows. The air inside felt colder than outside, heavy with that damp, metallic smell I'd noticed earlier. I flipped on the lights, the weak bulbs casting a yellowish, flickering glow over the main room. It didn't help much. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, refusing to be banished. Okay, Mike said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice still had a tremor in it. Okay, we're safe in here. Cabins are sturdy, right? I wanted to believe him, but looking around at the aged logs, the gaps in the walls, the single pane windows, sturdy wasn't exactly the word that came to mind. We should call someone, I suggested. Park rangers, the police. Mike pulled out his phone. No signal, he said after a moment of trying. Of course, middle of nowhere, remember. Great, I muttered. Just great. We were truly alone, cut off from the outside world, miles from civilization, with something lurking in the woods. We spent the rest of the evening in a state of tense unease. We made a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames offering a small measure of comfort, but the shadows still danced beyond the firelight, and every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, made us jump. We ate a silent, joyless dinner of canned soup and crackers, our appetites gone. The darkness outside deepened, pressing against the windows, making the small cabin feel like a fragile island in a sea of night. As full darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed again. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, were muted, almost absent. Instead, there was a different kind of sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, coming from somewhere in the woods surrounding the cabin. A slow, heavy beat, like a giant heartbeat in the darkness. Thump, thump, thump. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew steadily louder, resonating through the floorboards, vibrating in our chests. Thump, thump, thump. Do you hear that? I whispered, my voice tight with fear. Mike nodded, his eyes wide and fixed on the windows. Yeah. What is that? We listened, frozen, as the thumping grew stronger, closer. Thump, thump, thump. It felt like whatever was making that sound was getting closer to the cabin, stalking through the woods, its heavy steps shaking the earth. Suddenly, a new sound joined the thumping, a scratching sound at the door. A slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging across the wood. Scratch, scrape, a scratch. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked at Mike, my eyes pleading. He was staring at the door, his face pale and sweating, his eyes wide with terror. The scratching continued, circling the cabin now, moving from the door to the walls to the windows. Scratch, scrape, scratch. It was all around us, a relentless, probing sound, like something was testing the cabin's defenses, searching for a way in. Then the shrieking started again. The same high-pitched, chilling shriek we had heard in the woods, but closer now, much closer, right outside the cabin walls. It was deafening, ear-splitting, filled with a raw, animalistic rage that made my blood run cold. We clamped our hands over our ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It seemed to penetrate everything, vibrating through the wood, through our bones, into our very minds. The cabin shook, rattling on its foundations. The shrieking intensified, reaching a fever pitch of pure, unadulterated horror. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence descended again, heavy and absolute. The thumping stopped, the scratching stopped, the shrieking stopped. Only the crackling of the fire remained, sounding weak and insignificant in the vast, oppressive silence. We stood there, frozen, listening, waiting. The silence stretched on, minute after agonizing minute. Had it gone? Or was it still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for us to make a move? Neither of us dared to speak, to breathe, to even move. We just stood there, in the flickering firelight, listening to the silence, waiting for the night to end. The silence, after the shrieking, was almost worse than the noise itself. It was a silence pregnant with dread, a silence that felt like a held breath, waiting to be released in another terrifying outburst. We stood motionless, listening, for what felt like hours. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. Finally, Mike moved. He took a shaky step towards the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. Anything, I whispered, my voice hoarse. He hesitated, then shook his head slowly. Nothing. Just trees. Shadows. But his voice was still tight with fear, and I knew nothing. Didn't mean safe. It just meant unseen. We stayed like that for the rest of the night, huddled by the dying fire, taking turns watching the windows, listening to the oppressive silence. Sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind, made us jump, our nerves stretched to breaking point. Slowly, agonizingly, the first hint of dawn began to creep into the sky. A faint gray light filtered through the windows, chasing away the deepest shadows, but bringing little comfort. The woods outside remained silent, still watchful. As the light grew stronger, we dared to move a little more, to stretch our stiff limbs, to whisper to each other without feeling like we were breaking some fragile, dangerous spell. The cabin seemed to breathe a little easier in the daylight. The oppressive atmosphere slightly lessened, but the fear remained, a cold knot in our stomachs. When it was fully light, we cautiously approached the door. Mike grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. He slowly unbolted the door, wincing at the loud click in the silence. He pulled it open a crack, peering out. Anything? I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. He scanned the porch, the yard, the tree line. Then he slowly opened the door wider, stepping out onto the porch, the poker held ready. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest, expecting it to be there, waiting for us. But the porch was empty. The yard was empty. The woods at the edge of the clearing were silent and still, bathed in the pale morning light. There was no sign of anything. We stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold morning air, our eyes scanning every shadow, every tree, every bush. Nothing. Just the woods, looking deceptively peaceful in the dawn. It's gone, I said, my voice filled with disbelief. Mike lowered the poker slightly, but his grip remained tight. Maybe, he said, his voice still wary. Or maybe it's just waiting. We spent the morning in a tense, uneasy calm. We checked the cabin, every room, every corner, searching for what? Signs of entry. Proof that last night hadn't been a nightmare. We found nothing. The cabin was just as we had left it, dusty, worn, and strangely empty. We even ventured out into the yard, cautiously circling the cabin, our eyes fixed on the surrounding woods. Still nothing. The only signs of disturbance were our own footprints in the dew-covered grass. By midday, a fragile kind of hope began to bloom in our chests. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had been some kind of hallucination, stress, some weird animal we couldn't identify. We desperately wanted to believe it. We even started to talk about hiking again, about trying to salvage the rest of our vacation. The sun was shining, the sky was blue, the woods, in the daylight, looked almost inviting, but the feeling of unease wouldn't completely go away. The memory of the shrieking, the thump-ratching was still too vivid, too real. And the silence of the woods still felt heavy, watchful. In the end, we decided to leave. We packed our bags quickly, efficiently, without speaking much. We cleaned the cabin as best we could, leaving it as we had found it, old, dusty, and empty. As we loaded the Jeep, I looked back at the cabin one last time. It stood there in the sunlight, looking almost normal. A rustic cabin in the woods, nothing more. But I knew better. I knew what lurked in those woods, what we had heard, what we had felt. We drove away without looking back, bouncing down the gravel track. Back towards civilization, back towards safety. We didn't talk much on the drive, both of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the night we had just survived. We never went back to Yellowstone. We never talked about the cabin again, not really. It became an unspoken thing between us, a shared nightmare we couldn't quite explain, couldn't quite forget. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I still hear it. That low rhythmic thumping in the silence of my mind, and I remember the red eyes burning in the shadows, the chilling shriek echoing through the trees. And I know with a cold certainty that whatever we saw in Yellowstone, whatever chased us through the woods, is still out there, waiting, watching, in the silence of the wilderness. And sometimes I wonder if it's watching us, even now, even here, in the city lights, waiting for us to come back to its woods. So, if you're planning a cabin getaway in a national park, maybe rethink it. Maybe stick to hotels with room service. Because sometimes the wilderness is wilder than you can possibly imagine. And sometimes welcome to the cabin isn't really a welcome at all. My name is Johnny Blackwood, and I'm here to tell you about the stupidest camping trip of my life. Yellowstone in late October. Yeah, genius move, I know. My buddy Mark swore it would be awesome. Dude, no crowds, crisp air, the geezers will be steaming like crazy for Halloween. Mark's always got these grand ideas, usually involving minimal planning and maximum something, usually regret. Anyway, we drove in from Bozeman last Friday, set up camp near the Firehole River. Pretty spot, I'll give him that. Aspen trees all yellow and skeletal, with the river gurgling like it was talking to itself. And yeah, the air was definitely crisp. Freezing more like. By sunset, the temperature was dropping faster than my phone battery. We're not exactly wilderness guys. Okay, Mark's idea of roughing it is a hotel without room service. Me, I prefer my kutch and a pizza. But Mark's been on this get back to nature kick ever since his divorce. Said he needed to reconnect with the primal earth energies, or some other nonsense. I mostly came for the beer and to make sure he didn't do anything too spectacularly dumb, like wrestle a bison. First night, nothing much happened. Froze our butts off in our tents, ate some lukewarm chili, told some dumb jokes, the usual. Mark kept pointing out constellations, pretending he knew what they were. I just wanted to sleep. Second day, we hiked around Midway Geyser Basin. Grand Prismatic was, well, grand. All those crazy colors, the steam rising up like ghosts. Mark was in heaven snapping photos like a tourist on crack. I was mostly worried about falling into a boiling hot spring. Those warning signs with the skull and crossbones. Not exactly comforting. It was getting late afternoon when we decided to check out this smaller geyser. Mark had read about online something called the Whisper. Supposed to be off the beaten path. A hidden gem, according to some blog. Of course, off the beaten path, in Mark's speak, means vaguely described trail that probably hasn't been maintained since the Eisenhower administration. We hiked for maybe an hour, the trail getting fainter and fainter. Sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and the shadows were getting long and twisty. The air got colder, and this weird fog started rolling in, low to the ground, smelling faintly of sulfur and something else. Something metallic, maybe, hard to describe. Unpleasant anyway. You sure about this, Mark? I asked, pulling my jacket tighter. This feels off. Mark just waved his hand dismissively, pushing through a clump of pines. Relax, Johnny, come lately. The Whisper is just around the bend. I can feel it. Famous last words, right? We rounded the bend and there it was. Not exactly grand, more like unsettling. It wasn't a geyser in the classic sense, not a towering spout of water. More like a low, bubbling pool tucked away in a small clearing. The water was dark, almost black, and it wasn't steaming like the others. It was whispering. Faint, sibilant sounds, like someone talking just below the threshold of hearing. Mark, of course, was immediately fascinated. He practically skipped over to the edge of the pool, peering down into the murky depths. Foo, check this out, Johnny, hear that? I did, and I really didn't like it. It wasn't just the whispering sound itself, but the way it made my skin crawl. Like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper, colder. It felt wrong. Mark, maybe we should head back, I said, my voice a little too high-pitched. Sun's going down, and this place is giving me the creeps. He ignored me. Naturally. He was leaning closer to the pool now, his head practically over the black water, straining to hear whatever the hell it was whispering. I think it's saying something, he murmured, his voice hushed, almost reverent. Saying what, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He straightened up slowly, his eyes wide, pupils blown out like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe he had. Saying my name, Johnny. He whispered, his voice barely audible above the sibilant hiss of the pool. It's calling my name. And that's when things started to get really weird. Mark just stood there, staring into the black water, a goofy grin spreading across his face. It likes me. Johnny, it really likes me. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back from the edge. Mark, snap out of it. It's just a geyser. And it's creepy as hell. Let's go. He shrugged me off, his eyes still fixed on the pool. No, man, wait. Listen, it's telling me things. Telling you things. It's bubbling water, Mark. Sulfurous, probably toxic. Bubbling water. I was starting to sweat, even in the freezing air. This was bad. Mark gets fixated on stuff, but this was different. This was glazed eye weird. He took a step closer to the whisper again, and this time the whispering seemed to get louder, or maybe I was just imagining it. It was like a chorus of tiny voices, all murmuring at once, too low to make out individual words, but definitely directed. Mark, seriously, I need to leave, now. He didn't even look at me. He was swaying slightly, like he was hypnotized, his head cocked to one side, listening intently. Knows my secrets, Johnny, he whispered, his voice breathy. Things I haven't told anyone. Things I'd forgotten myself. My stomach's dropped. This was way beyond primal earth energies. This was full on crazy town. What secrets? Mark, you don't have any secrets. You overshare everything, remember. Divorce support group. TMI. Buddy, TMI. I was babbling, trying to break through whatever weird spell this geyser had cast on him. He'd chuckle low. Unsettling sound that didn't sound like Mark at all. Oh, Johnny, you think you know me so well, don't you? But you don't know the whispers in my heart, the things I truly desire. He took another step towards the pool, and this time I noticed something else. Something in the water itself. It was hard to see in the dimming light, but there was movement beneath the surface. Not just bubbles. Something shifting, like shadows swimming in ink. Mark, stop. I yelled, lunging for him again. This time, I grabbed his jacket and hauled him backwards with all my strength. He stumbled, finally breaking his gaze from the whisper, blinking at me like he was waking from a dream. Johnny. What's wrong? He sounded confused, disoriented. The goofy grin was gone, replaced by a bewildered frown. Wrong. Mark, you were about to jump into a boiling mud pit, and you were talking about secrets and whispers and stuff. You were freaking me out, man. He rubbed his eyes, shaking his head. Boiling mud pit. Johnny, what are you talking about? I was just listening to the geezer. It was interesting. He looked back at the whisper, a flicker of something longing in his eyes. Interesting. Mark, it was calling your name. It said it knew your secrets. I was practically shouting now, adrenaline pumping through me. He laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh. Come on, Johnny, you're imagining things. It's just the wind, playing tricks on your ears. And maybe I got a little carried away. You know how I get sometimes. Carried away. Mark, you were practically in a trance. And those whispers, I heard them too. They were real. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, maybe it was a little weird. Yellowstone's got that vibe, right? Spooky, natural, whatever. But let's just forget about it. Okay, it's getting dark and I'm starving. Chilly back at camp. He clapped me on the shoulder, trying to act normal. But I could still see it in his eyes, that unsettling gleam, that lingering fascination with the whisper. I didn't want to argue anymore. The air was getting colder, the fog was getting thicker, and the shadows around us seemed to be deepening, twisting into shapes that weren't quite natural. Yeah, I was freezing and hungry and desperate to get back to the relative safety of our campsite. Fine, I said, forcing a smile. Chili sounds good, but we are sticking to the main trails from now on, got it? No more hidden gems. He grinned, that goofy grin back in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. Deal. Main trails only, unless we just pop back to the whisper for one last listen. Just for a minute. No, Mark, I said, maybe a little too forcefully. Absolutely not. We are going back to camp. Now. He shrugged again, but this time he didn't argue. He turned and started walking back down the trail, but I could tell he wasn't really with me. His eyes kept flicking back towards the clearing, towards the whisper, and that unsettling grin still lingered on his face. As we walked, the whispering seemed to follow us, faint but persistent, carried on the cold, sulphurous wind. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the geezer whispering anymore. It was Mark, or something inside Mark, something that the whisper had awakened. And I had a terrible feeling that our stupid camping trip was about to get a whole lot stupider, and a whole lot more terrifying. The hike back to camp was silent, except for the rustling aspen leaves and that damn whispering that seemed to cling to the edges of my hearing. Mark walked ahead of me, his usual bouncy gait replaced by a slow, almost shuffling pace. He didn't say a word, just kept glancing back over his shoulder, towards the direction of the whisper. Back at camp. The fire was almost out, just embers glowing faintly in the gloom. The fog had thickened, swirling around the trees like ghostly dancers. It was colder than ever, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there. I busied myself with rebuilding the fire, needing to do something, anything, to distract myself from the creepy silence and Mark's weird mood. I piled on more wood, coaxed the embers back to life, and soon had a decent blaze crackling again. The flickering light pushed back the shadows a little, but the fog just seemed to press in closer, watching from the edges of the firelight. Mark finally stirred as the flames grew higher. He sat down heavily on a log, staring into the fire, his face pale and drawn in the flickering light. You okay, man? I asked, handing him a beer. He took it without a word, just nodding slowly. He popped the top and took a long swig, his eyes still fixed on the flames. You're still thinking about that gazer, aren't you? I said, trying to keep my voice casual, like we were talking about the weather, not some potentially malevolent geothermal feature. He nodded again, taking another swig of beer. It was calling to me, Johnny. His voice was low, almost a whisper itself. I could feel like it knew me. Better than anyone. Mark, it's a geyser. Hot water and gas. It doesn't know you. It doesn't call to anyone. I was trying to be rational, logical, but even my own voice sounded shaky to my ears. The atmosphere in the camp was thick with unease, and I was starting to feel it too. He shook his head slowly, still staring into the fire. You don't understand, Johnny. It wasn't just water and gas. It was something else. Something ancient. Powerful, da. Ancient and powerful mud, I muttered, taking a swig of my own beer. It tasted tinny and flat, doing nothing to calm my nerves. It offered me things, Johnny, Mark continued, his voice getting softer, more hypnotic. Things I've always wanted. Things I thought were impossible. Offered you things like what? Eternal youth. $1,000,000. A date with Scarlett Johansson. I tried to joke, but it fell flat, even to my own ears. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were different. They were still Mark's eyes, but there was something behind them, something cold and hungry. It sent a shiver down my spine. More than that, Johnny, he whispered, his voice now barely audible above the crackling fire. It offered me power. The power to have what I deserve, to take what's rightfully mine. Mark, you're scaring me, I said, my voice barely a croak. What are you talking about, deserve, rightfully mine? He smiled then, a slow, chilling smile that stretched his lips too wide, showing too much teeth. It wasn't Mark's smile. It was something else, something wearing Mark's face. Don't you see, Johnny? He leaned closer, his breath cold and smelling faintly of sulfur. Like the whisper itself, I've always been overlooked, undervalued. People take advantage of me, walk all over me, but no more. The whisper, it showed me how to change that, how to reclaim what's mine. Reclaim what? Mark, you're divorced, you work in accounting, you drive a sensible sedan. What exactly is being kept from you? I was trying to reason with him, but it was like talking to a stranger wearing my friend's skin. He chuckled again, that unsettling, wrong chuckle. You really don't get it, do you, Johnny? You think life is just this mundane, pointless existence. But there's so much more, Johnny. So much potential. And the whisper, it can unlock it. For me. For anyone who's willing to listen. He stood up slowly, his eyes still locked on mine, that chilling smile still plastered on his face. He took a step towards the edge of the clearing, towards the darkness beyond the firelight, towards the direction of the whisper. Mark, where are you going? I asked, my voice trembling. I'm going to listen to the whisper again, Johnny, he said, his voice almost dreamy. It has more to tell me. And this time I'm going to listen very, very closely. And with that, he turned and walked into the fog, disappearing into the swirling darkness, leaving me alone with the fire, the whispering wind, and the terrifying certainty that my friend Mark was gone. And something else had taken his place. I watched him go, a dark shape swallowed by the fog, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock my fear, Mark. I yelled, my voice cracking in the cold night air. Mark, come back. Silence. Only the crackling fire and the insidious whispering, now seeming louder than ever, slithering through the trees, into my ears, into my mind. Panic clawed at my throat. I wanted to run, to jump in the car and drive away, to leave Mark in this cursed place behind. But he was my friend. Stupid, annoying, divorce-crazed friend, but still my friend. I couldn't just leave him out there, in the fog, with whatever the hell was whispering to him. Taking a deep breath, trying to ignore the tremor in my hands, I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled after him. Mark? Damn it, this isn't funny. The fog was thick, disorienting. The beam of my flashlight cut through it, but only for a few feet, the light swallowed by the swirling white. The trees loomed like skeletal giants, their branches gnarled and twisted, reaching out like grasping claws. And the whispering, it was everywhere now, a constant, sibilant murmur that seemed to come from the fog itself, from the trees, from the very ground beneath my feet. Mark. I called again, my voice weaker this time, laced with fear. Where are you? No answer, just a whispering then, faint, but distinct, a chuckle. Mark's chuckle. Different, Darkholder. It seemed to come from ahead, deeper in the fog. I stumbled forward, pushing through the swirling mist, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Mark, is that you?" Another chuckle closer now. And then a voice. Mark's voice, but twisted, distorted, like it was being filtered through something inhuman. "Johnny, is that you? Come closer, Johnny, I have something to show you." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to get as far away from that voice as possible. But it was still Mark's voice. A part of me, a stupid, loyal, terrified part of me, still clung to the hope that he was still in there, somewhere, trapped beneath whatever influence the whisper had over him. So I kept going, pushing deeper into the fog, towards the voice, towards the darkness. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now, a chorus of sibilant voices that seemed to be chanting, murmuring something. Something ancient, something evil. And then I saw him, or what was left of him. He was standing in a small clearing, bathed in an unnatural, sickly green glow that seemed to emanate from the fog itself. He was facing away from me, towards the whisper, which was now bubbling more furiously than before, the black water churning and swirling like a cauldron. But it wasn't just the green glow or the churning water that made my blood run cold. It was Mark himself. He was changing. His back was hunched, his shoulders broader, his limbs longer, more angular. His clothes seemed to be stretching, distorting, straining against a form that was no longer quite human. And from his back something was emerging, slowly, grotesquely, pushing through the fabric of his jacket, tearing at his skin. Spindly black limbs like spider legs or claws. They unfolded from his back, jointed and sharp, twitching in the green light. I gasped, a choked, strangled sound that died in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. I was frozen, paralyzed by horror, watching as my friend, my buddy Mark, was being unmade. He turned then, slowly, deliberately, and faced me. And I saw in his face, it was still Mark's face in a way, but stretched, elongated, the features sharpened. The skin pale and translucent like stretched parchment. His eyes were black, completely black, no pupils, no whites, just empty, bottomless blackness. And from his mouth a long, thin, black tongue flickered out, tasting the air, tasting me. "Johnny," it said, the voice a grotesque parody of Mark's, a rasping, clicking, inhuman sound. "You came. I hoped you would. The whisper, it has so much to offer. For both of us." He took a step towards me, those black, spindly limbs clicking on the rocks, his black eyes fixed on mine, burning into my soul. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just the whisper that was ancient and evil. It was what the whisper served. What it summoned as cabal. The necromancer. The legend, the myth. The nightmare whispered in dark corners of forgotten libraries. He wasn't just a story, he was real. And he was here, in Yellowstone, using the whisper, using Mark, tough to what? To return. To unleash something even worse. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran. I ran like hell, stumbling, falling, scrambling through the fog back towards the camp, back towards the car, back towards any semblance of safety, any shred of sanity. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. But I could hear him behind me, not running, but moving. A swift, clicking, inhuman gait, closing the distance with terrifying speed. And the whispering, always the whispering, closer now, louder, directed at me. "Johnny, don't you want power? Don't you want to know your secrets? The whisper, it's calling your name too, Johnny." I reached the camp, fumbled for my keys, jumped into the car, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine coved, sputtered, and finally roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and tore out of the campsite, back down the trail, back towards the main road, back towards anywhere but here. I drove all night, didn't stop, didn't sleep, just drove, the rearview mirror filled with the swirling fog, the whispering wind, the memory of those black eyes, that clicking gait, that monstrous smile. I'm in a modal now, miles away from Yellowstone, miles away from the whisper, miles away from Mark. If that thing can even be called Mark anymore. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm safe. I don't know if anyone is safe. Johanna's cabal, he's real. And he's in Yellowstone. And the whisper is calling. I can still hear it, faint but persistent even here miles away in this anonymous modal room. Whispering my name, whispering secrets, whispering promises. And I'm starting to wonder maybe I should listen. Maybe power isn't such a bad thing after all. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe the whisper's right. No. I have to stop thinking like that. That's what it wants. That's how it gets you. But what if it's already too late? What if the whispering is already inside my head? What if I'm already starting to listen?